All right, so this is our, oh, we got Gabriel. This is our final session on the Theatetus. We're reading the sections from where Theodorus takes over the argument to the end. So all the discussions of doxa or opinion, right opinion as the idea of what knowledge is, but also all the discussion with Theodorus in the middle before that. And then, as we just mentioned, for next time, we're going to be back on the Heidegger Essence of Truth book. And the reading for next time is going to be in part 2, that is his interpretation of Theaetetus, which he just read this for. It'll be through the end of part 3 of, section 3 of that. So that's the stepwise unfolding and proceeding in all its connections. Basically, everything about perception, the thesis that knowledge is perception in this book will be the next one. We can talk about the time at the end, but I'm thinking 3 or 4 weeks out. And then that will leave one additional session on the last part of this book for all the things on doxa, right opinion, and untruth. So we'll have 2 sessions on finishing up the Heidegger essence of truth. But for this time, it's just the balance of this book. So I've got things I want to make sure we talk about, but want to get a chance to do the round of who managed to do the reading. Have you read this dialogue before? Other exposure to Plato, these things? Especially if the answer was that you didn't manage to do the reading. If you've done the reading, the other things are a little bit superfluous. Although if you want to tell me you have a long history of scholarship on this thing, or you wrote a thesis on it or something, you definitely want to know that. Anyway, so we want to start with Carlos.
I did not do the reading. I was preoccupied with a number of other things, including a little shoulder surgery.
Hope you're doing well.
What?
I said, I hope you're doing well.
Yeah, it's coming along just fine. It's just that it's very cumbersome having one arm. But I intend to do the reading. Hopefully, the order of reading and discussion does not interfere too much with the benefit from it.
Okay.
Just listen to that.
Sounds fine. Joe?
I always have to find the little microphone. Yes, I did all of the Theatetus. We had 4 or 5 weeks, I think, so I had plenty of time. And I began to read into the subsequent Heidegger thing, but I did not get very far. So I'm caught up. The question is, I want to look forward to the discussion because there's a lot of things there that were built into the Theatetus, and I want to see how they fit further into the whole pattern here, and how they've been carried into the present day, which I sort of recognize. Yeah, the idea of justified true belief appears to have originated here.
Correct. The justified part changed into it morphed out of with an account, but that's the definition of the last definition of knowledge that Theaetetus advances is that maybe knowledge is right opinion with an account, and what an account means. That's sort of turned into justified later. But there's also an argument against that definition at the very end of this, which we'll talk about. But it is definitely, this is the point of origin of that understanding of a definition of knowledge. Craig?
No, I didn't do the reading. I got through all of it. A little tough at the first half of what we were assigned, but I actually really enjoyed the last section when he got into letters versus syllables and bringing out the points of problems with ontology when you don't know how to parse things out, and then you got multi layers of parsing, which kind of goes to some of the stuff that I've been doing with Hartman and Poley about multi-level ontologies and why you have to have those. So found that interesting. And then I got sidetracked, or I thought I was kind of getting sidetracked into a very interesting book called Patterns of Discovery, which was Hanson's book prior to Kuhn's theory of on scientific revolutions. But Hanson talks about, he started the first recent, if you get to the 50s, recent delving into seeing as versus seeing that, and the theory-laden aspect of facts, that all facts are interpretations based on a theory. And so suddenly it started bringing me back to the allegory of the cave, back to the Theatetus, and I found an interesting connections between the two. And I really liked Hanson's book because he's dealing with the philosophy of science and how science is done in the modern era, or how it was thought to be supposedly done in the 50s, and we've strayed away from that quite a bit. So an interesting digression, but actually turning out to be very relevant to some aspects of the discussion we're going into.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that some of the stuff in Kuhn, and maybe some of his predecessors as well, is indebted to some of the understandings you get from Heidegger and before him Nietzsche in a way, on sort of the way in which framing assumptions, framing interpretations, structure scientific paradigms, something like that, which also blossomed into structuralism. I mean, one of the first instances of structuralism is what Heidegger does in his understanding of history of metaphysics. It's sort of a paradigm of structure that was used by a lot of the French structuralists after that. So there are connections connections there to some of that stuff. I think there also may be connections, well, not so much connections as allusions to some of these issues in the Theaetetus, just in the examples that he chooses of things, and also in the dichotomy he lays out between the philosophies he's criticizing, sort of the ancient version of relativism, if I can put it that way, as a perception-based understanding of truth, which would be heavily interpretation-laden, that he's contrasting with the some sense of an expertise, which is claiming to be more than that, something like that, where Theodorus is the example of that, and geometry is the paradigm of that. But alongside geometry, astronomy is also mentioned as one of the things that which Theodorus is the expert in measure, and not just everyone is a measure for astronomy. And it's interesting to note the similarities and differences as there might be in Theodorus as a measure for geometry as opposed to for astronomy, because one does involve observation and the other does not. And one can be known much more clearly and certainly than the other. There's also a place in here where he brings up that it's not true that error only occurs in things having to do with perception, though. He brings up error in mathematics. So anyway, we'll get into some of those things. I'm just saying that there's some allusions to those problems in the original Plato's understanding of it. He didn't have the understanding of role of interpretation and theory that you get in someone like people you're talking about, or in that matter in Heidegger, but he is presenting everything he's presenting as a descent from a kind of background fluxist ancient relativism that he's treating as a sort of conventional wisdom before him, and also as a fad sweeping Ionia and the Ephesians these days in the time when he's talking to Theodorus. So we can talk about some of those things when we get to the substance. All right, Gabriel, welcome. Glad to see you after a while.
Yeah.
Hope you're doing well.
Yeah, pretty good. It's a Monday over here in New Zealand, but we got a holiday for the Queen's passing, so I can join. So yeah, I read the reading. It was quite enjoyable. I'd read it before, but not with quite as much sort of attention as I did this time. So it was quite interesting. And I liked, you mentioned this in the first talk, but I liked how much he steel-manned the opposing position. So yeah.
Yeah, we'll get to there's a lot of opposing positions alluded to along the way. There's almost a typology of them laid out here, but we'll get to that in the parts with Theodorus. Steve, did you manage to do the reading, all that kind of stuff?
Yes, I've read the whole thing, and I've not read it before. I feel like I've read some secondary literature, but it's been quite a while since I've read stuff about that. But yeah, I enjoyed it, so I'm up to speed.
Okay, we might come back around first impressions. Check. Still on mute. Now you go.
Hi. No, I'm still way behind. The church adult education year is just about to start. And so I've been tied up with that. But I did at least get my feet a little wet in the ideas of this particular dialogue. And I very much look forward to the discussion as it concludes. But I'll eventually go back through and listen to all of the discussions.
Okay, great, thanks. So Brian doesn't have a mic, so he's putting in the chat that he read the second half this morning. He was familiar with the account, True Judgment from his epistemology class. Want to read it again to fully understand it. That's fair. Useful. Lazar, don't know if your mic is working. If you just want to lurk, it's okay too. All right, I think we got mostly, most people skip first impressions. We got a little bit one from Craig, but other people want to go into some of their first impressions on reading it and things they want to raise as problem areas that they noticed or want to bring up. Joe?
No, nothing is at the front of my mind now in terms of how to open the discussion. I am interested in this general question because I have often heard the phrase, the slogan, justified true belief. And you sort of take it for granted because it makes sense just verbally speaking. But it is nice to know where it came from and why, because there is more there than just a statement of it. I'm personally, somebody who is reading, Craig, I think, reading a philosophy of science book. And I must say that I am also right now nearly finishing Carnap, Introduction to the Philosophy of Science, which I think is a fascinating book. And I would not have read it at all if I hadn't been assigned by my other discussion group, because Carnap sort of is famous in my mind, wrongly I suppose, as being a logical positivist type out of the Vienna Circle. And those guys, generally speaking, I don't much agree with, but maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. So anyway, this is all very interesting. You know, getting the root of knowledge. Yeah, that's really what I'm at.
I think it's fair to say that from Plato's point of view, the Theodorus school of mathematicians is kind of standing in for the logical positivists of his day. He has very similar reactions to the Fluxus fad sweeping Ionia as modern analytic philosophers might have towards continental philosophy these days. So some of these patterns do recur. And when Plato wants to discuss Protagorean relativism, right, he'll do so with a person who was a geometrician and an astronomer, even if he studied with him beforehand. Because he wants that contrast between that sort of exact science thing versus the, think of it this way, the conventionalist nature of the Protagorean position. But useful modern connections. Steve, are there particular things you want to make sure we focus on, or first impressions you want to?
Yeah, so I'm currently spending a lot of time on Kant, the critique of per reason. One thing that struck me maybe like a week after I read it, Theatetus, was that it kind of covers the two sources of cognition that Kant covers, you know. So there's the sensation, and then there's the understanding, basically. So like the first half of Theatetus is perception, and the second half is sort of like the abstracted knowledge and the account and that sort of thing. So I thought that was kind of interesting.
Yeah, it's fair to say that that distinction persists long after, and Plato is kind of its point of origin, the sharp distinction between perceptual knowledge and noetic understanding, conceptual knowledge, what later became called rationalism, right, is made clear here and in places like the Republic. That's one of the reasons why when Heidegger was always translating perceiving and perceiving with the mind, still calling it perceiving, and using perceiving for all of it, it was irking me a little bit in some of our previous reading of that part of it. But definitely the end of the discussion of Theaetetus's thesis, which happens after the Theodorus part closes, is very much directed at this question of can perception be knowledge if there's something like radical rational knowledge that has nothing to do with perception and is completely independent of perception in a way. Yeah, and I think Heidegger will also bring out the two sides of this when we get back to him. But it's fair to say that that the problematic created by that perception versus noetic, if I can put it that way, definitely persists down to the time of Kant. Okay, Gabriel, do you want to give first impressions or things that you want to see discussed?
Not particularly. I thought it was interesting that knowledge is justified true belief was heavily critiqued by Plato, and yet it's also typically taken to be his position. So I guess that's quite interesting. I'm sure you'll discuss that, but I'd be interested to hear why that's happening.
Yes. Yes. I mean, shorthand by the end of it, he's going to say something like the with an account part. When you sufficiently analyze what we mean by with an account, you'll find that what counts as giving an account is itself something you have to unpack. And as soon as you've unpacked it, you find it's marked around with sufficient qualifiers that what you're really saying is knowledge is right, a true opinion that also has knowledge. And so you wind up referring to knowledge on the right-hand side of the definition. The justification part is just the left-hand side smuggled into the right-hand side. And that's the nature of his objection at the end of the dialogue, so it becomes circular. Now, whether or not you can turn justified into something which is independent of the knowledge you're trying to define, that's why people changed it from with an account to justified and tried to make all kinds of careful distinctions about that. But the original way that he puts it here, he perhaps willfully ties it off in the knot of when you're saying with an account, you're saying with knowledge, and that's just referring to itself. So that's the formal way that the dialogue ends, is in the aporia created by that, the absurdity of that self-reference. We can ask in the whole discussion of what counts as an account, whether or not there's a whole nother theory of knowledge smuggled into that, what it means to give an account. Our translator, Joe Sachs, thinks that there is such a subtext of a consistent way of understanding gathering together and giving an account, and the logos as being something which is being referred to in the theses that are put forward by Socrates and not quite picked up on by Theatetus, and therefore left and sort of remain unrefuted. And then if you sew all those together, he thinks there's a kind of coherent account of logos understanding as knowledge there. I think a plausible claim can be made for that, but it's also definitely the case that Socrates is not bringing that out and placing it right in front of you. He wants you to treat it as a problem and work for it to see that instead of hitting it with the head with it, just characteristic of the method in general. Wonderful. Brian, I think you joined us a little late, but or maybe you just had to switch devices. Do you have first impressions you want to give us? Oh, I see. You've got it on your phone because you were on the chat before. I see.
Yeah, can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Yeah, so I took epistemology, so I'm used to justified true belief. And one of the first things you learn in epistemology class is why that doesn't work, because of a problem called the Gettier problem. But I agree with one of the other persons that was speaking. He's pretty much said that he was surprised that Socrates criticized that account. And so I was actually surprised too at the end that he didn't, like he was challenging that account.
Yep. No, and most Socratic dialogues have that aphoretic nature. They'll end by some kind of argument for or refutation of every position advanced, to end in some so we don't know, but continued inquiry will make us better kind of methodological position, and that's just, it's the most characteristic Socratic move. But he certainly is doing it here. He's not putting forward a single theory of what knowledge is, stumping for it in the manner of Aristotle after having refuted all of its alternatives and saying, I've got it figured out, so we can move on. It remains a problem in the way he presents it. Okay, so Craig, I think you gave us some of your first impressions. Do you have more first impressions, or do you want to get over?
No, I just wanted to let you know that I've already spent 4.5 hours on a previous Zoom call. So if I'm dozing off, don't take it personally.
Fair enough. There are limits.
That was the second day of 4.5 hours. So it was actually almost 9 hours of presentations. And so I'm already a little fried. So take it from
Okay.
there.
Okay, great. So
I have a request for Craig.
go ahead.
Can you post a link to that book that you mentioned when you first showed it, some book that you had been reading about?
Philosophy of Science book.
Yes,
Yeah, I'll post a link on it. Sure.
thank you.
Sounds great. Okay, so let's talk about the actual structure we have in our reading, because there's actually quite a bit going on there, and we're obviously steering towards the second half of the dialogue. We're going to deal the whole idea that knowledge is right opinion, true opinion, and there's going to be the qualifier of with an account, which only comes in at the very last section. Before that, we're examining right opinion itself without that qualifier being put on it. But it takes us quite a while to get there. We actually have the full refutation of the position that knowledge is perception also in the section we're reading. And we definitely need to cover that. And then we also have the whole section with Theodorus. So Theodorus is dragged into the argument, kicking and screaming, so to speak, and made to stand for one fall, right? In the Spartan wrestlers analogy they're using. There's one thesis that he agrees to examine with Socrates, which is whether or not he, Theodorus, is the appropriate measure for questions of geometry and astronomy, or every man is a measure of every question, right? So that's the slightly strawman version of the thing that Theodorus agrees to go over with Socrates. And when they get to the end of that, he's to be let go, and they'll go back to Theaetetus. Theaetetus wants them to go on the topic they were on, the two of them, but Theodorus won't have it. So he bows out after that point. But that means that there's a section in the beginning of what we're reading where it's Theodorus is the main interlocutor, and there's a whole bunch of things covered there. The first of them is the sort of argument against Protagoras from the coherence of his position, if I can put it that way. This is, where his idea that man is the measure is applied to his argument itself. And the question is, if the world doesn't agree with him on the claim, he has authorized the world to be right in its disagreement with him, and the world has not authorized him to be right in his disagreement from them, right? So there's something like that going on. When they're summing up at the end, Theodorus acknowledges that as a good argument, although Socrates himself doesn't treat it as disposing of the question. But there's an underlying thing going on there, which is there's a kind of objection that Socrates has to, if not Protagoras' whole argument, to a tendency he sees, a result he sees from Protagoras' whole argument, which is that it tends to equalize human knowledge. You have to, face it squarely here. His problem is that Protagoras' theory of knowledge results in equality of knowledge, and Plato or Socrates is against that equality of knowledge. He's not against it, on moral grounds is unchoiceworthy. He's against it on phenomenal grounds. He doesn't think it happens, right? He thinks that there is real differentiation of knowledge across human beings and what they know about. And if your theory of knowledge cannot account for that variation, if it puts forward too universal a view of how knowledge happens for human beings, it's going to be phenomenally false. That's the actual nature of the argument here. And the kind of cutesy argument from self-application is meant to be something that will appeal to the let's assume the premise he gives us and reason to a contradiction sort of conclusion, a way of reasoning that the geometer Theodorus will be used to. But the underlying, if you look at the actual things that this argument depends upon, the thing that it's mostly turning on is this uniformity or non-uniformity of the incidence of actual human knowledge. And man the measure makes all men the measure of anything that they perceive. And that's what Socrates thinks is phenomenally untrue. He tries to put in a self-deprecating measure that he himself doesn't want to be made a measure of the things about which he is ignorant. He wants to be able to defer to Theodorus when it comes to being a measure on geometric diagrams and astronomy, which is an appeal to an interest Theodorus has in the non-uniformity of knowledge. If you remember that the whole dialogue began with them sizing up students about whether or not they could pay and that sort of thing. So there's a commonality there of that Protagoras himself was a hired professor, and they appeal several times to the fact that Protagoras himself claimed to be wiser than others and have things to teach them and so forth. And is that consistent with his own position? Okay. So, but the point is, knowledge, an adequate theory of knowledge has to account for the non-uniformity of knowledge. And that means it can't hang its hat on something which is so universally true of human beings that it cannot differentiate between the presence of absence of knowledge across human beings. That's the underlying sort of Socratic point. And I think that that's a fair point. He puts words in Protagoras' mouth to make concessions on the part of Protagoras that are meant to strengthen his argument. Well, he will have Protagoras say, well, they don't differ in how much the things which seem to them are true for them, but they do differ in the better or worse things that happen to them, something like that. And this is the bringing in of advantage or better and worse, which brings in this aspect of knowledge as being predictive success, something like that, true prediction. Knowledge is characterized by true prediction as opposed to inability to do so. And that's the other place where there's evidence of non-uniformity from the universal opinion of mankind, something like that. So as a way of appealing over Protagoras' arguments to the phenomena, I think all that works. It's not clear that Protagoras would actually make all the concessions that Socrates sort of puts into his mouth to try to strengthen his argument. And Socrates plays around with that, has fun with that, so to speak. At one point, he has Socrates' head appear out of the ground to make a counter argument, and then be whisked away beneath the ground. And it's useful to notice that it is a fake Protagoras with which Socrates is arguing, right? Anyway, so and he's always encouraging Theodorus to stand up and make these objections on Protagoras' behalf, and Theodorus sort of basically never takes the bait. He's usually on Socrates' side of the argument he's having with Protagoras. Okay, but what does the agreement about better and worse, what is that doing there? It's an attempt to strengthen a kind of naive knowledge is what everyone has of the things they perceive, relativism, to handle the counter objection from non-uniformity, to handle the counter objection from inability to predict, and to make the advantageous a sphere in which something knowledge-like happens in the, if it's not in the knowledge-like a sense of perception that Protagoras wants the word to mean, in some other manner, right? There's some other knowledge too, which is ability to truly predict the future as to the advantage and the disadvantageous. And Socrates is strongly claiming that no one is bold enough to claim that everyone is always right in their opinions or perceptions about what is advantageous. And in the course of that, he does make concessions on some of these other things. He'll say that when it's a matter of, what they perceive in sensation, people might be the measure of their own experiences. And it might even be that they are the measure of their own experiences, or cities are the measure of their own experience when it comes to the just and the unjust, the beautiful and the ugly, the holy and the unholy, right? He mentions all these things, which is, think of it this way, the thesis of conventionalism. So the thesis of conventionalism is mentioned here several times. And this is the idea that what the city sets down as being just for it is what is just for it, as long as it continues to set that down. But this won't work, Socrates claims, for the advantageous, right? The city cannot make something advantageous for itself by setting itself down for itself as advantageous. So this is an argument we also see in the Republic. This is kind of the position of Thrasymachus. Thrasymachus thinks that justice is the advantage of the stronger. He's got this conventionalist view that kind of goes along with the similar relativism to the one you're getting from Protagoras, but it's been extended to the city. And now the claim is that what counts as just or holy or beautiful or right from the standpoint of the city is whatever the city thinks is in its advantage. And then Socrates is pointing out, but the fact that they think it's in their advantage doesn't mean that it is. when they make errors, they set down what is not advantageous for themselves as just. That's the argument you get in the Republic. Okay, there's a whole separate argument there about the that we'll get to. But what's the actual position of things like the just and the holy with respect to knowledge? Is there knowledge of them, or are they something about which there isn't knowledge, but only something like opinion or taste? And Socrates is allowing for a variety of these positions, that you could have nothing but perception is knowledge for anything about your own experiences, but not for advantage in the future. And then you might even have it for what counts as just or even as holy. That might be purely conventional, but that still won't get you to advantage. When you're talking about the good and bad, when you're talking about actual advantage, as they put it in the Republic, people are not content to have the reputation for the thing; they need the thing itself, right? So the paradigm example is: it doesn't matter if the entire city agrees that it is good to invade Sicily. If you invade Sicily and lose the war, Athens is going down, right? So the city doesn't actually know what is good for it in the future, and that is not a conventional matter. It's not a matter of opinion. That's the claim here, and this is meant to be a refutation in the hard-nosed cynical person's own terms of his own doctrine. So it's this Thrasymacheian doctrine that's on trial here, rather than the Protagorean one. I don't know if people noticed all that going by. You know, if you're not familiar with some of these other arguments, it can be easy to miss. But that's what was going on with that discussion of, you know, maybe it's true that what is just or unjust is just whatever the city sets down as just or unjust, and lots of people would insist upon that strongly. He says he's trying to make concessions to, this is a place where some people would think that Protagoras is right, but it's not right enough, Socrates says, to make his actual theory of what knowledge is correct. Reactions or questions about any of that part of it? Just went right over everybody's head. They didn't notice it was going on. Is it the case that there's nobody here who wants to take Protagoras' side in any of this, or wants to take modern relativism side in any of this, and would stump for the other side of these propositions, or is everybody here already convinced by the Socratic/Platonic position on these things?
Yeah, that's I'm convinced. I'm not a relativist at all. I mean, I'm a relativist in the sense that Heidegger introduced, where one has to interpret context as being an element of what the real thing is, but beyond that, no.
What about with regard to what counts as beautiful or ugly or holy or unholy for a city?
Well, obviously, at the individual level, that's totally relativistic. It's whatever your opinion is, and other people don't have to share it. Now, for a city, now you're beginning to beg the question as to what is the opinion of a city? Okay, are you going to have a ballot? Are you going to have public opinion polling? I mean, there's an aggregation problem here that really stops me.
Well, in the case of Athens, they have a public assembly of direct democracy with all the adult citizens who have complete power to do anything they want, including constitutional power, wherever they have a simple majority. That's the answer to your question.
Well, obviously, I think that's not desirable. It's an unanchored mob rule, as Aristotle, I think, called it.
Yes, but the question is, there's all kinds of practical objections one could have to that, obviously, in terms of the passions that could sway such an assembly and so forth. But if they decide that for the sake of the city will treat this as being, what is praiseworthy, or this is what is holy, or this is what is sacred to us, or this is what is our law, does that have any force whatsoever, even as a conventional thing, or is it just nonsense?
Well, as a conventional thing, you can say that, well, you know, given what all my neighbors are going to be telling me, I'm not going to necessarily gainsay them and cause an argument. But I wouldn't necessarily share the point of view. The problem with the democratic ideal is that we often look upon it as bivalent. It tells what the people want in one theory. I never look upon it that way because I worry about the problem of aggregation. But when
Sure.
it comes to a political process, I definitely want the mob, as it were, to have a veto. We say, no, I don't believe that point of view. So I favor the veto, the negative side, but I don't favor the affirmative side of the democratic judgment theory.
Understood.
politics.
Understood. And I don't want to get all the way into political theory. I just to bring up the conventional aspect there. The conventionalists like Thrasymachus think that cities have the power to determine what counts as just for them, in the same way that someone has the ability to perceive whether or not they're seeing this or feeling this, or there's no accounting for taste in matters of the palate, something like that. And that the just thing to do in a city that has proclaimed something to be just is to conform to its definition of what is just, as long as you're in that city, until it changes what it's asking you to do, right? So there's just a simple, because it's a purely conventional matter, whatever the city, whatever its means of deciding are, decides as its convention in the matter, follow that convention as long as that convention is its convention, something like that. And
This is
that's
like the traffic laws. You go to a different city and they're supposed to drive on the other side, the wrong side of the road.
sure. Those have
yeah.
a pragmatic, practical aspect where there's a value of cooperation. There probably is a value of cooperation and agreement on some of these other things too. The city tends to take these things way more seriously than that, though, especially when you're talking about a matter like the just. And what the conventionalists are saying is they don't really take seriously the city's ability to tell them what is just, but they don't take the just seriously enough to differ with it on the point either, right? That the just is something not really natural, not really real. It's just conventional. So if the city wants to say X is just, we'll go along with whatever the city says, with the same kind of indifference and just getting along, because there's no truth there, so to speak. So we would say, because it's just a matter of opinion, right? Just go along with the majority opinion to not rock the boat. That's the position the conventionalists had on all those questions, whereas they might reserve something like a more hard-nosed and calculating notion of truth for things about calculated advantage, right? Realism in foreign policy. You think of how a Machiavelli would think about the mores of a city, right? They're just something to conform to for the sake of getting along in the city and not ruffling feathers. But when it comes to whether or not you should make an alliance with Venice or Florence, right? That's a serious matter. That's not something to be decided purely conventionally. That requires calculation. The fate of the city in the future is on the line on that, and that's something where you have to have expertise the same way you would in geometry. You don't just go to everyone's opinion on a matter like that. That's sort of the position that the conventionalists were laying out. They wanted something like a statesman-like expertise in matters of the city's advantage for foreign policy, or maybe in economic policy or something like that internally, but for matters of what the domestic laws were, so to speak, whatever people want, it's fine, right? That's the position that conventionalists had. Does that make sense? I think, by the way, Socrates is laying out the position. He's talking about how some people would insist on it strongly, in part because he's trying to show an element of, if not necessarily reasonableness in Protagoras' position, another group of people who would agree with him, so to speak. But he himself is not stumping for that conventionalist position. And that becomes clear a little bit after, when he brings in the difference between the philosopher and the non-philosopher and their perspectives. But I want one of the things which is going on in this whole section with Theodorus is they're assessing everything like the status of the things that the conventionalists regard as conventional, right? Is there actual truth and knowledge about things like the just and the holy, or are those things something about which there is only convention because they're not as naturally grounded as advantages, something like that? Or is even that distinction unnecessary because everything is in the category of everyone is the judge of their own truth on the matter, the full Pythagorean relativism position. But that typology is being laid out here, and Socrates is probing Theodorus on it, as well as, if I can put it this way, positioning Pythagoras in a continuum of opinions on the reality or unreality of opinions about the just and the holy. Okay, the position that Socrates is insisting upon most strongly there is this advantage position. And what's noteworthy about that is it's a place where he's agreeing with the hard-nosed conventionalists, right? He's agreeing with the Thrasymachus and Machiavellis of the world, right? He's saying they're right that there's no way of making it to be a matter of mere opinion what the good or the advantageous is, right? That is natural and real enough that it is subject to actual knowledge or lack thereof. It's not a matter of opinion. And things that Plato would call the good are in that category. So he's hiving the good off away from the just and the beautiful as having this more naturalist, future-oriented reality that even the cynic would recognize, something like that, as the effective. So any questions on what he was doing there or why that all that came up? Okay, news to people. The next thing we get is the philosophers versus the rhetoricians. We get he brings up the contrast between the silly philosopher who's completely useless in matters of practical life and in court, and the rhetoricians. Why is he doing this? I mean, Protagoras is a teacher of the rhetoricians. He's a sophist who's a teacher of the sophists. He's a teacher of rhetoric. And one of the things that Socrates is bringing out is the way in which Protagoras's theory of truth is itself a form of persuasion. He's flattering mankind by calling each of them the judges of their own truth. He's elevating them to standards of truth. And he thinks that he's going to get their votes by buttering them up, by telling them that they're the standard, not the expert. And it's a kind of democratic and everyman appeal that is meant to be persuasive. And Socrates is diagnosing this as part of the appeal of relativist arguments generally, is their equalizing tendency is also an empowering tendency to one's own judgment. There's an element of pure flattery in it. And he brings this out by relating it to how the pleaders argue in the law courts, right? Protagoras is, if he claims expertise on anything, it's on what arguments will be persuasive in the law court. And at the same time, he's advancing this relativist theory of truth. Is this a coincidence? Not according to Socrates, right? How do the rhetoricians act in the court? Well, they're on a water clock. He says, while the water is running, right? They have to make their argument quickly and persuade quickly. They cannot make exhaustive arguments. They cannot steelman appeal to reason. They make appeals to emotion. They make appeals to interest, and they flatter. They are always flattering the judges. And so Socrates is saying part of what relativism is doing is flattering the judges and treating every man as the judge. And they're in a way kind of expecting that if this theory of knowledge authorizes every man to be the judge of truth, that every man will say, oh, he gave me the vote, I'm for this theory. And that's also why there's an element of poignancy in Socrates appealing to universal opinion about the existence of expertise against him, right? He's almost saying there are more people in the world who believe in expertise, at least when they're in dire straits, as he puts it. He says, you know, if they're in disease or war or terror upon the sea in a storm, they will not believe in the equality of knowledge and not consider themselves the measure of all things, but will look around for a knower to save them. Right? So the people believe in expertise when they acknowledge their own lack of understanding, their own lack of knowledge, when they are at sea, so to speak. And this is itself also a kind of rhetoric appeal. It's also a kind of appeal to experience, but he thinks that humility about what they don't know is a more universal human self-understanding, so to speak, or can be, than the pride of thinking that one always wants to be the judge of all truth, something like that. So in that whole section where he's talking about the argument from applying the standard of every man being the measure to itself, this stuff all comes up because all of these semi-political things, semi-rhetorical things, are involved in that argument. He's trying to appeal to a universal opinion that expertise exists, at the same time that Protagoras is trying to appeal to everyone wanting to be the measure of their own truth. And the way in which those two are in competition with one another, clash with one another, therefore has to be brought out. So there's also a lot of, put it this way, abuse of the rhetoricians. The rhetorician's standard is not truth, it's persuasion. They're seeking advantage, but the way they seek advantage is by a persuasion that doesn't care about truth. And when we get into later parts of the dialogue and questions of opinion, this issue of the rhetoricians in the court will come back again. But you have to notice the kind of jujitsu going on. We appealed to expediency and then brought up the rhetoricians. And the rhetoricians are people who, out of considerations of expediency, are only interested in persuasion, not truth. Right? In their court context, persuasion, the expedient thing is to treat persuasion as more important than truth. At the same time, you get all these allusions to the way in which philosophers don't know anything about that sort of thing. They're completely hopeless at that sort of thing. They're spending their time measuring things under the earth and the heavens instead of what goes on in law courts. So they don't even know the way to the law courts, right? All of this kind of stuff. A lot of this is allusions to the portrayal of Socrates in the clouds by Aristophanes, right? He's portrayed as the semi-physicist, the young Socrates with the semi-physicist who only investigated the natural things and had his head in the clouds, and he's the Thales type who would fall into the well. In the play The Clouds, he is presented on the machine. So that in the Greek plays, they had a machine to lift someone onto the stage, the wire props for someone to come in, in the air, which they used only for the gods. And Aristophanes's comic innovation in The Clouds was to put Socrates in that, right? He was basically saying that Socrates, treated himself or thought of himself as a god, and he's suspended over the rest of the play. And so that's being alluded to here. And then Socrates also says, if you get some of these people in a philosophical conversation, they'll feel so at sea that they'll feel that they're being dangled in the air, right? Again, another reference to that same playwright thing. But there's a definite contrast here between the philosopher who's concerned with truth and doesn't know anything about all these practical things versus the rhetoricians who are all concerned with these practical things. So you have to ask yourself, how true is this of Plato or the Socrates that Plato is portraying here? It's meant to be true of philosophers as such. It's almost certainly true of the Socrates of Aristophanes' Clouds, or the young Socrates, as described in the Phaedo. It's probably true of Theodorus, the person he's talking to, who is, the astronomer and geometrician who is saying, "Yep, that's exactly the way it is," to all of his descriptions. right? Because he's describing being an astronomer in a city that's all concerned about politics, right? But is it true of mature Socrates? Does Socrates know the way to the marketplace? Where does he spend every day?
Yes.
He's presented as not knowing the way to law courts. He leaves the end of this dialogue to go to the court of the king Archon to answer Miletus's charge against him. He doesn't have to ask someone where it is. So there's elements of this which are comic in their portrayal of the starkness of the contrast between the philosopher scientist, so to speak, who's only interested in the rational argument and is completely impractical, and the rhetorician who's always before the law courts. At the same time, this is all being presented with this whole theory of, you know, conventionalism and advantage and the nature of law and all this, you know, learned political theory, so to speak, which doesn't exactly go along with only knowing about the heavens or things under the earth, right? This Socrates is clearly not a natural scientist, right? The concerns that matter to him are all of these, you know, what is virtue, what is knowledge kind of questions, which are human-directed questions. But he's playing up. Go ahead.
But he, you know, he's still found guilty, though, right?
Oh,
So,
absolutely.
Even as practical as he is, I mean, he still is not able to win.
If he's trying to.
Yes.
He even in the apology, he even alludes to the fact that he believes that the reason he was convicted was that you are more convinced not by these current accusers who are laughable, but by the accusers who accused me long ago. And he means Aristophanes and the plays. He basically says that he thinks that he was convicted because of the image that philosophers in general have from that sort of treatment. So that it's thought to be true of all of them that they are atheists, for example, right? But his standard is certainly not winning in the law courts, and he says here you can't expect me to win in the law courts. He's not claiming to be better at predicting what is persuasive in a law court than Protagoras is. Certainly, that's okay. But there's a whole bunch of stuff going on in that section with Theodorus that I wanted to bring out. The sort of deepest of them is when he gets to his own arguments against conventionalism. Deepest of them. This is the section where he talks about gods and justice, that if they knew anything about the gods, they would know that no god does injustice, and that the most important thing is to become as much like a god as possible, to be godly, and the way to do that is to get away from here to there as quickly as possible by becoming just and holy in intelligent judgment. And he says that those who don't do this do not know that they are condemned to a penalty that no power can escape, because there are patterns laid up in the nature of things in which the divine leads to happiness and the impious to unhappiness, right? So he's stumping there for there being such a thing as an actual natural truth about what is just and holy, in contradiction to the conventionalists of all stripes. And he's appealing past them to a kind of a piety of justice, and that piety of justice has all to do with this not chasing after the things that the city thinks of as important and good, about which it contends, the power that it is all concerned about, but instead to be concerned with things which are higher than that and more eternal than that. And compared to the rhetoricians, that means being a free man concerned with the truth instead of a slave racing the clock to try to flatter the judge who is going to rule on your case, right? So that's the place where you get the sort of peak of the contrast with Protagoras, right? Socrates is contrasting his own life with Protagoras' life. Okay,
You have a section, Jason, where that is, that you can refer me to?
sure. 176 B, C to down to the beginning of 177.
Thank you.
There's one chance remark just before that, where he even is, this is 175A, where there's an allusion to the allegory of the cave, which I thought we'd bring up. Reading that. Where is this? Yes, sorry. This is on page 68 of our edition, which is Stephanus 175C. He says, but my friend, whenever he himself drags someone upward, anyone who is willing with him to get past his, what injustice am I doing to you or you to me, into an examination of justice and injustice themselves, et cetera, et cetera. And there, the descriptions there match the content of the Republic, the Meno, various other Socratic dialogues. But the description of that is dragging someone else upward, which is the precise description of what the returning liberator does in the Myth of the Cave. So the philosopher dragging some Athenian into the discussions that occur in the Platonic dialogues is here directly presented as what the paradigm of liberation was in the allegory of the cave. Even using the drag upward language. And Theodorus' response is, if you could persuade everyone what you say as you persuade me, there would be more peace and fewer evils among human beings. So he's completely convinced. He's on the side of all this, and he thinks it would bring more peace. But notice the thing that he would have to succeed at for that to happen would have to persuade a lot of people. It's not obvious that he's going to. Okay. I want to mention quickly or briefly the two arts in which Theodorus excels, where he is brought in as the paradigm of being a judge of these things, are geometric diagrams, he says, and astronomy. And those are presented as almost equivalent to one another in being expert things. They're the kinds of things where you wouldn't trust the man on the street's judgment just because he had a perception of them. Looking at a geometric diagram or looking at a star in the sky are not going to get you to the knowledge of them that Theodorus has, right? And that far, I think, is an unassailable argument, but it's still useful to notice the contrast between them. Now, later we'll get an example of mistakes even in mathematics, so it's not true that he's appealing to geometry because it's a place where there are no mistakes or where knowledge is certain. That's not his standard. But there's still a difference between them. Of astronomy still depends upon, well, a lot of things, but observation. It depends upon a long past. It's attempting to know something extremely difficult to know. Knowledge of it is, he's not necessarily saying that here, is always way more tentative than the knowledge of geometry is. No one has changed any of the proofs set that Theatetus himself wrote for the section of Euclid that was written by him after this dialogue was written. But probably nobody believes the astronomy that Theodorus was teaching to Theaetetus, right? Some of the calculations for the calendar are probably still basically correct, right? And many of the things they did were probably math problems of that, like with continued fractions or something, and adjacent to the mathematics. But the detailed ways in which they understand all of those things is obviously completely changed. Does that mean that Theodorus didn't have knowledge of astronomy? It's a useful question to ask, right? How should a definition of knowledge treat what Theodorus knows about astronomy that the average man in the Athenian street then didn't know about astronomy? And does it matter that Theodorus obviously has tons to learn about astronomy, even from a man in our street today?
Some kind of a threshold.
It's not simply a threshold, I don't think, because a person in the street today might have more true opinion about astronomical matters than Theodorus did, but that doesn't mean he necessarily would understand any of the structure of reasoning or the relationship between observation, reasoning, and a hypothesis that of what is happening in the heavens that Theodorus had. Theodorus might have more in common with a modern astronomer than a modern man in the street does. It's not obvious. It's not obvious the role in which the connection between being able to reason abstractly about these things and the correctness of the opinions you arrive at are each related to there being knowledge or lack of knowledge about it. At one level, you could say, until you know that you have the perfectly correct opinion about it, you don't know that you have the right opinion part of the right opinion definition. So it's just opinion and not necessarily right opinion. If you don't have an account like Theodorus has of astronomy, like the modern man in the street, maybe it's not knowledge for that reason, even if the things you have the opinions about are entirely correct. But it's still slippery, and we're going to get to this more when we get to the justified true belief aspect of things. Socrates wants to be able to appeal to Theodorus as a measure of knowledge in matters of astronomy. And it's not remotely clear how much you can do that. Anyway, it's a problem that's there in the dialogue. An adequate understanding of what knowledge is would properly ticket and sort where Theodorus's knowledge or lack thereof about astronomy falls. It's a criteria a good definition should meet, which is more than just avoiding the pitfall of claiming that knowledge is even across all human beings, right? Okay, I also want to bring out one thing. We talked about all this stuff about the city having a perception of what is advantageous for it and sometimes being wrong about that. He uses the expression, this is 178a, that when they fail in that, they miss their target like an archer, right? They aim at the target, but they miss it. This missing the target had a long afterlife as what became sin when it was translated out of Greek. But it's also going to come back in the question of how error is possible in the opinion half of the dialogue. But it comes up here in the question of advantage. The fact that the city seeks its advantage when it lays down its laws about what is just doesn't mean that they hit it. Okay, and it's worth asking why that is. The part that Socrates brings out is that knowledge to count as knowledge has to be stable under this relationship to the future that perception doesn't have about it. Perception has a rootedness in the present without any necessity of carrying into the future. When we get to some of the models of memory in the second half, we'll also see ways in which theories of knowledge can involve trying to tie the past to the present. Past experience and concepts formed from past experience imprinted in memory to present observation, right? That's sort of the memory arc that we'll get in the wax model. But the way in which the different time ecstasies of truth are tied together is definitely going on here. It's definitely a problem here. It doesn't take a Heidegger to bring that up. In the section that we're still dealing with now, the thing he brings out first is the relation to future. Knowledge should include, especially knowledge of the advantageous, should assume a relation to the future. So one of the things that might justify true belief when we get to that point, right, would be that it makes theoretical predictions. Okay. All right, so the conclusion from all that is about the things that are going to be in the future, Protagoras isn't a judge, right? The knower is the judge of the things in the future, not every man and not Protagoras. So Protagoras' theory of knowledge fails to account for the manner in which the expert can predict the future and the average person who has perception but does not have that expertise cannot. Okay. It's like one of the other central objections against Protagoras on the, while we're still trying to refute the his perception thing. There's an aside though, I noticed at 178E, when he's trying to bring up all these examples of it, he makes his case very hard for himself by mentioning among the forms of expertise, the pastry cook is going to prepare a gourmet meal. And the question is the person who's going to eat the banquet a proper judge of the goodness of the banquet? And he says, when it's a matter of what things will, how things will be in the future, the pastry chef is a better judge than the consumer, so to speak. This is not obvious. The pastry cook is a recurrent theme in Platonic dialogues, hard as that might be to believe. When Socrates is explaining how he will fare in law courts in the Gorgias, he says the philosopher brought into the law court is like a doctor brought to trial before an audience of children by a pastry cook on the accusation that he makes them eat things which taste bad. Right. So there's again this allusion to the duel with the sophists as the flatterers of the city, who are the pastry chefs who will just give a sweet cake and not what's good for people. Whereas Socrates or philosophy, by trying to tell people what's good for them, will encounter the resistance of the dispenser of foul tasting medicine. Okay. All right. So the last thing I want to talk about in the Theodorus section, I think it's the last thing, is the faddish nature of the Fluxus Sophonasia Minor. Because this is that when he's not done talking about the Protagoreans before he has elicited from Theodorus his own recent experiences with them, which is that they are people impossible to pin down, who hit you with one cryptic saying after another, and they won't, if you ask them to explain the cryptic saying, they just pull out another one and hit you with a second cryptic saying and laugh at your inability to understand them. And they're always moving out from under their previous positions and won't stand still and all of that, right? And as a description of the frustration of an eminently reasonable man with an unreasonable form of argumentation, right? It's true to it hits home, so to speak. And Socrates says, well, maybe that's just when they're being heuristic. Maybe that's just when they're fighting their opponents. But probably when they're alone with their disciples, they're much more reasonable and they lay out their things in measured, even ways. And Theodorus says, what sort of disciples, you strange fellow? Among such people, one doesn't become another's disciple. They sprout up spontaneously, whether each of them happens to get his inspiration, and one regards each of the others as knowing nothing. Right? So they're all in competition with one another to have their own opinion pass as the latest and greatest thing. Okay. So there's a faddish nonsense aspect of that. And what is Theodorus's diagnosis of this? Well, we can't argue with them; they're hopeless. But we should put down their theses in elaborate sentences and then reason them out like we would a geometry problem, right? So this is exactly the picture of how the analytic philosopher views a frustrating continental philosophy he doesn't understand. Right? I can't get a straight answer from these people, but I can diagram their sentences and figure out whether or not what they're saying follows logically. That's the way he wants to approach it. I think clearly that isn't going to quite work. He's not going to capture what they're actually saying in the diagram sentence, but Socrates might in the longer form things he's laying out. And this here Socrates brings up again that there's an underlying metaphysical theory, so to speak, behind this whole school, which is the all is flux notion, the everything in motion notion. And he had already brought that up with Theaetetus, but now he's on it with Theodorus. And Theodorus basically just agrees that, yes, that's what they're basing their opinion on. He doesn't really have an argument against that opinion, against that position. He only dislikes its effects. And the effects that he particularly dislikes is that it renders unstable his own expertise. At one point, Theodorus says, if they were right, saying anything in its opposite would both be equally right and wrong. Right? It's like he's spent too much time with Hegelians, right? But that is Theodorus's objection to the underlying fluxists. Okay, one of the reasons this matters is there's another side of the argument which they sort of raise but don't get to. Socrates says, yeah, that's one group of people, but the other group of people is the Parmenideans, right? Who say that being is the name of the all because it is completely at rest. It has nothing in which to move, right? So he mentions the opposite of the fluxus is the Parmenideans, and then when Theodorus wants to pursue the matter of what they think, he says, I have a holy reverence about dealing with Father Parmenides, so to speak, and it would take us too far afield. Let's get back to Theaetetus and his thesis, right? So he ducks the confrontation with Parmenides. It's useful to know the dialogue following this one is the Sophist, in which the Parmenidean stranger is going to come in and not duck that conversation, but it's not Socrates who takes it on, it's the Parmenidean stranger. And in that way, the Sophist is kind of a follow-on / companion to the Theaetetus, and this book of Heidegger's is kind of a follow-on companion to the essence of truth question, because some of the things which are raised in Theaetetus don't get answered in Theaetetus, they get deferred to the Sophist. So the point is to see that in this big confrontation between the different schools of metaphysics, right, a whole half of the conversation is alluded to and then missing from the rest of the dialogue. And it's only going to come in later. So you have to see what is said about what is knowledge here is having a provisional aspect. We haven't heard from the Parmenideans on what is knowledge. In Sophist, they lay out 3 sorts of people that they should try to capture in their word nets. The Sophist, the statesman, and the philosopher. And they have a whole dialogue about the Sophist and a whole dialogue about the statesman, and there's no dialogue about the philosopher, unless the Theaetetus beforehand was that dialogue, right? But the Parmenidean stranger never goes looking for the philosopher with his word nets. Anyway, this is one of Plato's, put it this way, artistic devices to put incompletion brackets around some of the arguments he makes. He knows he's leaving things out. And one of the ways he leaves things out is leaving a door to another conversation, another school, another possible thesis, another argument to be made. And he doesn't always follow through on those, right? Sometimes purposely, sometimes not. But all of the Platonic dialogues have these little connections with one another and these little back doors to one another. It's meant to be a maze, if I can put it that way. And that's why I'm unsurprised if at the end of the dialogue he will attack his own thesis that true belief with an account is knowledge. Okay. What else is going on here? So we need to keep in mind that the fluxists claim that there are no underlying categories, basically. Everything is always changing in all the ways. And all the ways means local motion, motion in place, but also change of type. And every concept that you try to put something other is just a type that the thing itself is changing out from under, right? This is the underlying fluxist argument. And it's an argument basically for something like the imperfection of conceptual knowledge, right? In Nietzsche, this will mature into the claim that truth is the kind of error without which creatures like us cannot live, right? So the point is there's already a foretaste of that here. this is going to come out again in the end of the dialogue when we get to the example of language and whether or not there are atoms of conceptual thought, or something like that. But there's a whole metaphysical challenge to, are there any entities stable enough that concepts about them could rise to being actual knowledge, as opposed to a mere practical approximation to things for our purposes, right? And the Fluxists can marry up with the Cynics about how you treat those things. What do I mean by the Cynics? I mean that by the Cynics, I mean the conventionalists or Semichians, right? Who think that when you're talking about true prediction and seeking advantage, it might make sense to talk about one conceptual frame as being better or worse than another, but it's better or worse for some purpose you had, which might be persuading the jury, and truth might not be how you did it, right? And that's very far from there can be a set of concepts that completely encapsulate something such that, rational knowledge, the relation among those concepts is knowledge of the thing, right? Where the paradigm is geometry. So, okay. Anyway, all of that's going on just in the Theodorus section. When he wants to close up the Theodorus section, he basically gets his agreement that Theodorus, is the measure when it comes to the geometry questions. They agree on the fact that knowledge is unequally distributed across human beings, and that Protagoras can't account for this fact. They agree on the advantage point, that advantage and future advantage escapes any possible conventionality, and they agree on the fact that Protagoras' argument is exposed to a reference to itself kind of attack that will, it's the people that it authorizes to be true judges of truth will rule against it, and it will then back them and rule against itself. Okay, so those are the arguments that Theodorus accepts, and with that he exits the stage after a bit of a plea from Theatetus to continue the discussion about the Parmenideans that they don't do. Okay, so that at that point, Theatetus himself will come back on the stage, and we're going to deal with the last part of the thesis that knowledge is perception. But before we get back to Theatetus, any more questions about any of the stuff we just went through in the Theodorus section? Carlos.
Yeah, back to the recent Theodorus' opinion or knowledge is more valid than the common man.
Yes.
If I understood you correctly, the answer to that is that his knowledge is able to make predictions accurately, or did I miss some of it?
Several things. I mean, yes, even in matters of astronomy, his knowledge is able to make predictions more accurately. When the place where they're talking about predictions, they don't appeal particularly to Theodorus's astronomy knowledge. They appeal to other things like the ability of the doctor and the gymnast to predict what is good for people and that sort of thing. Much more down to earth examples. But yes, it would also apply to Theodorus the astronomer being able to predict the next rising of Sirius or something in a way that the man in the street could not, right? So in addition to that, there's Theodorus talks about how he proves things in his geometry texts, and he gets endless objections from other people who do not know what they are talking about, who cause him endless trouble, right? But all of them are wrong, right? Each of them, didn't understand some part of the argument. He can refute each of them in detail, right? They clearly don't know, right? So he has the fact that someone disagrees with one of his geometry demonstrations never phases him for a second. He never thinks that, oh, I might be wrong because someone disagrees with me. It's always just a clear error on the other person's side because he's proved it, right? And his proofs and their arguments there's never a real problem. It's always a merely apparent problem. So those are the aspects of Theodorus's own experience that Socrates can appeal to get him to agree that it's silly to think that knowledge is evenly distributed across people, right?
The refutations against Theodorus are not valid because there are proofs that establish that those refutations are merely a reflection of lack of understanding of the underlying principles.
In the case of the geometry stuff, this is asserted, and it's almost certainly true. We're not given any of those examples. He doesn't give us the proofs that Theodorus uses, right? But we can persuade ourselves that it is so if we go read a little bit of Euclid.
Anyway, but it depends on the availability of proofs.
Well, it's fair. I mean, in the case of the geometry, it does. In the case of the astronomy stuff, they aren't proofs; they're arguments and some predictions.
Okay.
One of the reasons this is of some interest is, as I said, you know, a proper understanding of what knowledge is would be able to categorize what Theodorus has correctly, and there's an element of his what he knows being based upon reasoning that. Because it's based upon reasoning, not just perception, every man in the street is not going to have, but also because it's based upon sound reasoning, anyone who reasons about it soundly and understands the terms should be able to verify what he says. So there's an element of, I'll go to this way, potential publicness, potential mutual knowability in the kinds of things that Theodorus knows. Theodorus is not claiming that he knows the next rising of Sirius will be because he got a revelation from on high. He can show you his work, right? And that's essential to it counting as knowledge that he has it, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions about the remarks about all the Theodorus stuff? There's a lot there. One of my first questions is, when people were reading through this, did they see anything like this amount there? Were these issues live for you, or is this stuff? I mean, it's written in so breezy a fashion you can easily just zoom right past it.
I certainly thought of the conflict between analytic and continental philosophers and how that seemed to be that language and that sort of way of arguing can often be used by continental philosophers, and analytic philosophers get very frustrated about that. So I saw that.
What about the stuff about did you notice the stuff about the truth or conventionality of opinions about the just and the holy?
Yeah.
Do you have a thought on what he said about any of this thing?
It's a good, I guess it's a good example, because with those things, we're more, I guess, as modern people inclined to say there is a lot of relativity there or subjectivity. And so you can kind of see, you can kind of see the other side, I guess. It seems like there must be both in that, both some objectivity and some subjectivity. So with the case of the city making laws, the laws themselves are somewhat arbitrary, like, with the traffic laws, but even more, complicated laws. But they should be based on justice. There's something objective about justice. But if you don't obey the traffic laws, you're still being unjust. So there's a mixture of the two.
Yes, I mean, this is one thing that Plato himself takes up in the Crito, where the question that Socrates is, the practical question he's considering is, having been condemned, should he escape? Or should he remain for his punishment? And he has an argument the night before with his oldest friend, who is arranged to get him taken away to Thessaly, where he'll be safe. And Socrates has a long argument with him about what he owes to the city for having reared him and let him live to 70 as a philosopher. And in the end, he decides to stay, or tries to convince Crito that he should stay. I don't think that Socrates himself is ever in actual doubt on the subject, but he thinks that Crito can't understand why he's doing it. It's not clear that all the arguments he presents there are why he's doing it. Aristotle, by the way, when after the death of Alexander, who he had been the teacher of, so he was in fine fettle and was in a great worldly position while Alexander was alive. But after Alexander dies, he's sitting in Athens being thought of as the teacher of that tyrant Alexander who reduced Athens to slavery under the Macedonians, and they come after him, that is Aristotle, much the way they had come after Socrates. And Aristotle simply goes to Thessaly. Now it helps that Thessaly is right next door to Macedon, but he simply goes to Thessaly and lives the rest of his life there happily. He does not see an obligation to the city of Athens requiring him to stay there. But that question of what even the unjust city, what demands even the unjust city can make upon you is definitely an open one in the dialogues. The part which I think is meant to be it's meant to be kind of his strongest argument here. I don't know if it is a strong argument, but he's contrasting the philosophical life with if I can put it this way, the power-seeking life. He talks about those who become involved in political power and are degraded. They become unjust, saying and doing unholy things, and they become clever in shamelessness, etc. And he says that those who do that, they suffer an injustice that they suffer a penalty for that injustice which they have no power to escape. And he's contrasting this with the stripes and wounds that even the just often suffer, he says. And that's where he mentions these patterns established in the very being of things, of the divine is most happy and of the godless is the most miserable. But not seeing that this is how it is, through their folly and senselessness, they are unaware that they are making themselves like the latter by their unjust actions and unlike the former. And the penalty they pay for it is living a life in the image of what they've become like. So that's the penalty they cannot avoid. The penalty that the person who rejects the idea that there are patterns of justness in the nature of things cannot avoid is living a life that itself will be patterned upon the shameless, unjust, merely expedient things that he thinks about the whole, something like that. And that's what he thinks is his strongest argument for something like a natural justice.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, I just because that's kind of a peak there, I was wondering if you had noticed it or had thoughts on it, but useful to know which of these things stand out and which things fly by. All right, any more comments on the Theodorus section before we turn back to Theaetetus and the final refutation that knowledge is perception? All right, so Theaetetus brought back into the argument. We haven't actually fully dispensed with knowledge is perception. You might think that we have, but Socrates has yet another arrow, right? He has another argument he wants to give to Theaetetus and not to Theodorus. And this one is carefully given, but it turns upon the difference between what you know by the senses and what you know by something which isn't simply the senses. And this is where we get to the stuff that we brought up at the very beginning as this sort of rational knowledge stuff. It's kind of like the second pole of the Kantian distinction between experience and rational knowledge. This is also where he distinguishes between knowing with the senses or knowing through the senses. And he claims that we know things through the senses. We're using the senses as organs, but it is our mind or reason which puts together the results from them. And then he gives examples of knowing that each of the two senses is the same as itself and different from the other, and knowing that that between the sense of sight and the sense of hearing there are two, and these sorts of things. So and the examples may seem trivial, but what they are is they're meant to be examples of purely rational knowledge, the rational knowledge by concepts. And this purely rational knowledge by concepts, he elicits from Theaetetus the question, well, what sense do you use to know those? And there obviously isn't a sense you use to know those. There might be a common sense that puts them together, but that's not the way it is explained here. Instead, Theaetetus says these seems are known by the soul itself directly, right? The soul itself knows these things directly. So we discover that there is a form of knowledge which is not based upon perception, but which even perception feeds its results to, and that even the results of perception have these rational truths about them, but these rational truths extend to things which are not taken from the senses. There is even also error about them, which we'll get to later. The example of the 11 and the 12 in the calculation of a pure math question. But the perception of something as hard or soft is done with the senses, but the perception of something as being equal to itself and different from something else, and two things being two, not one, are rational perceptions that are completely independent of the senses. Okay. And then it's pretty fast from there to agreeing that those rational truths are the truths about the being of the things. So being comes in here very directly as the thing. He asks him, into which of these categories, the things known by perception or the things known by reason, would you put being? And he answers in the category of the things known by conceptual thought, basically, by the soul directly. And the other things he mentions along with it are all the things that would later by the medievals get called the transcendentals. They're also the things that in the next dialogue, the sophists, will be called the highest kinds. They're things like and unlike, same and different, motion or rest, being, good, one, all of these sort of categorizations. All of those are known by conceptual thought by the soul directly, is the claim. And being is one of them. And this is agreed by Theatetus practically immediately. And from that, it almost immediately follows for him that if those things are independent of the senses and they reach being, that the senses which don't reach those things don't reach being. And the giant distinction between the real and the apparent world happens right here. Right? That's where it happens. And he says of these perceptions, if they don't reach being, can they reach truth? In that order. And Theaetetus agrees, no. So it's not truth under being inside conceptual knowledge. It's conceptual knowledge has these primitive primary categories, we can put it this way, these primary categories, ideal-like categories, and it reasons about them by the soul directly, independent of experience. And among those are judgments of the being or non-being of things. And those judgments, truth is reached by or after those judgments about being. And if that's accepted, which it is, practically instantly by Theaetetus, it follows that the whole sphere in which knowledge as knowledge of being and truth happens is distinct from the sphere of the perceptibles, which is what we get in the Republic with the divided line and the whole distinction between the perceptibles and the noetic and all that kind of stuff. That all also happens again right here in those few agreements of Theaetetus about the knowable things that are known directly by the soul itself, including judgments of being. Okay. Thoughts or opinions, reactions to any of that happening? It's very fast.
I guess to kind of point out the obvious, it's kind of highly debatable whether what's more real is what's intelligible, let's say, intelligibly apprehended, versus what's actually physically apprehended, sensed.
Yeah, he doesn't say more real here at all, and he doesn't talk about actual. Certainly for the actual, relating the actual to the perceptible might be very on point, right? Lots of the later medievals would say actual means being an act, means affected by the category of time, means it has to transpire in time, and that's going to put it firmly in the realm of the historicals and the perceivables, something like that, or at least potentially perceivables. But he's not making an argument here about actuality.
but truth. So we want to distinguish truth from real or actual.
Well, let's just go over it. So let's, so he talks about first of all, the things which we know from the senses or through the senses.
What page are you on?
Sorry, page 84, that's Stephanus 185. C and D is where we're starting. What is the power through that reveals to you what's common to all these things as well as these. When you attach the names is and is not, and whatever we were just asking about, it applies to them. What sort of organs will you allot to these, through which what is perceptive in us perceives each sort? And Theatetus understands him quickly by saying, you're talking about being and non-being, and likeness and unlikeness, and what's the same and other, and also one and the rest of the number having to do with them. And it's clear that you're also asking about the even and the odd, and as many other things as follow along with these. Through which of the things that belong to the body we perceive them with the soul, right? So we clearly perceive them with the soul, and the question is, what piece of the body do we use to perceive these purely intellectual things? And he says, we have no special organ for these things, but the soul itself through itself appears to me to observe the common things involved in all things. So he's even adding that it's common things involved in all things. There's an element of abstraction from an all things involved in it as the common, right? But it's the soul itself perceiving the commonness that is the only basis given. And Socrates says, because you are beautiful, you say things that are beautiful, right? You save me a long speech if it is apparent to you that there are some things that the soul observes itself through itself and others through powers that belong to the body. So Socrates realizes there's a giant argument there, and he thanks Theaetetus that he doesn't need to make it because Theaetetus already accepts that the soul itself through itself knows such things. Okay. And then the very next question is, then among which would you place being? For this, most of all, follows closely upon everything. So he appeals to the fact that Theaetetus has said these were the things which were seen to be common across all things. He appeals from that to being as most common, and as most common should fall in the categories of things that are the common things that the soul knows itself by itself. And Theaetetus says, I place it among the things the soul itself by itself reaches out for. And the like and unlike and the same and other, yes. What about the beautiful and the ugly and the good and the bad? It seems to me that it's the being of these as well that it looks to, especially in their relations to one another, gathering up in itself the past and present things in relation to future ones. So he uses both the temporal gathering together and the gathering up logos notion here as all of the forms, all of the Platonic forms, right, being gathered together in this. And of even things like the hard and soft, the being of the hard is a judgment of the soul. The hardness is a judgment of the senses, right? And he also, says that the things which are common to humans and animals and are perceived right from birth are the perceptibles. But the things which are learned with difficulty and over time through many troubles in education are these things known by the soul through the soul. And so that's all established by the end of page 85, beginning of page 86. It's, a page and a half. And from that, in just a few exchanges, he will get the agreement that if these are what reaches being, they're also what reaches truth. And if perception doesn't reach to them, it doesn't reach to truth. And that means that the perceptual world is an apparent world and not a true world. That's the substance of the argumentation of the grand, where did Plato get off inventing a distinction between the real and the apparent world is right there. It's not obscure. It's not, super involved. It's not some esoteric doctrine, 20 pages long. Joe, question.
Yeah, I was just thinking back in my mind, does this go also to the analytic versus synthetic distinction? Because if the soul is the perception thing, then is that just the analytic? Because things you observe, of course, are not there. They're the synthetic side of things.
So in Kant, this whole programmatic gets related to what is independent of perception, where he wants to motivated in part by the challenge of empiricism out of Locke. He wants to try to distinguish the elements of reasoning which are independent of all experience, and independent of all experience there in a way that he's trying to make rigorous, and that will lead him to distinctions like the a priori and what are analytic and synthetic judgments. He does think that there are synthetic judgments a priori, so he's not simply making the distinction between analytic and synthetic line up with the distinction between known from experience or a posteriori and known before experience or a priori. But that's like his big question is, are there synthetic a priori truths? That's what the critique is kind of about. But that whole way of laying out the problem is definitely informed by all this and by the debate with empiricism post Descartes. But all this is before any of that, and he's not appealing primarily to an independent experience of you have to make sure you didn't get this idea from experience. Instead, Theaetetus allows that it is what is known by the soul itself through itself, that it appears to me to observe the common things involved in all things. So it's precisely the commonness across all the things that can be observed of these categories that makes them independent of the particular content of experience. The term there, by the way, is koinen, and the same we use for coin. And that's going to be something Heidegger will make something of. But the common to any possible perceptible, right, makes something a category, Kant would say, of the understanding, right? And from Plato's point of view, these things make the atomic transcendental concepts. Why do we call them transcendental concepts? They're transcendental because they apply to, from the medieval point of view, they apply to things before the distinction between finite and infinite being. Or they apply to being as such as opposed to the particular beings, or they apply to everything, right? So the applicability of these concepts to everything, and according to Theaetetus's intuitive notion here, their derivation from the what is common to things, what is common to everything, right, go together, right? They're meant to be the possible judgments about things which don't care about what kind of thing it was. It doesn't care if it was a thing you saw or a thing you heard. You can have being judgments about it. You can have like and unlike judgments about it. You can have number judgments about it. All of the machinery of mental understanding that is independent of the sense you learned it from, or from whether or not you learned it from the senses at all, seems to be, to Plato, in a sense, more basic, more fundamental than the things it comes from. Now, an evolutionary biologist might look at that the other way. He'll say, okay, so you have some notion of these things being common, and that means they're abstractions. That means you took a generalization across 7 senses or 5 senses, whatever, and came up with your 6th common sense, right? But it was just a generalization from a bunch of empirical things, and that's why it was difficult to learn. You learned it only gradually, or something like that. But from Plato's point of view, that just begs the question, right? Why would you have a machinery for making those abstractions if that didn't work? And why would it work if it wasn't the way the things actually are, and the way the different bits of the world that you can perceive differently are actually knitted together, right? From Plato's point of view, it's a real pattern in things that these common concepts correspond to, right? Now, we already saw the Fluxists disagree with all that. They think that any concept map is just going to be, some lossy conventional map thrown over things, right? But here Theaetetus is firmly on the other side of that divide. He's a geometrician, and he thinks that when you're talking about how I understand about even and odd and all that, I understand them by my reason. This is a man who proves theorems about infinite classes of irrational numbers, right? You're not going to convince him that his knowledge of things which are immaterial is false, right? He knows that it's not. So he rapidly agrees that it is things common to the common things involved in all things are the basis of the concepts that are the purely rational concepts.
I have a question.
Yes.
Was that, is that noetic knowledge that he's talking about? Is that?
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
Okay.
This is the founding of the idea that the noetic realm is a realm distinct from the perceptible realm. This is where that founding distinction is being elaborated, explained, its motivation given. Yeah.
It seems Plato still has a problem similar to the Fluxists because he still has the world of everyday experience. He still has the physical world of flux. And that makes me wonder, how can, I get the mathematics, I get how you can have perfect knowledge of that, but how could you have knowledge of anything in the world, including astronomy, presumably?
And Plato's answer is going to be that you can have only approximate or probabilistic knowledge of it insofar as it is affected by the category of time. And you can only have perfect knowledge of things which are eternal. And Aristotle is going to partly agree with that, even in the posterior analytics, and say that there are no true sciences of things affected by time, even though he's thought of as being this, empirical biologist, right? And you have to ask what he means by that, and he means something like the patterns that the biologists understand have to be more outside the material particulars and more stable than the material particulars that are outside, or the knowledge of them isn't science. What makes the knowledge of them science is the fact that you can reason about them logically and your logical deductions go through. And you don't reason logically about material particulars. You have to turn some piece of your knowledge about them into something like a mathematical hypothesis in order to be able to use something like abstract reason on them. And as soon as you're doing that, you are committed to the heroic assumption that your logic is going to map the realities. Now, there's different takes on different people in the history of philosophy about all that, absolutely. And Aristotle is not in the same place as Plato about how all this works. He thinks that these concept things exist primarily in the mind, and Plato thinks that they are primarily patterns in things, which are also, before they're patterns in particular things, are patterns in the bones of things, so to speak, in the common things, the common things. So it makes Plato a Platonist and not an Aristotelian. So there's giant distinctions in here, but the underlying motivation for making a distinction between the perceptible world and the rational world is this simple. That's the point. That's the point I want to drive home to people. It's not like where this happens is some obscure place, right? It's right here, and the argument is this long.
There's an underlying current throughout all of this, and not just that, but many other considerations of thought. And it's time. The concept of time by itself.
Yes.
I don't know that do the Socratics deal with it in particular? I mean, it's very difficult.
186b. It seems to me that it's the being of these as well that it looks to, especially in their relations to one another, gathering up in itself the past and present things in relation to the future ones. So he already knows that this understanding business is some kind of gathering up that's trying to relate past and present to future. There's other places often, pardon me, often the Parmenides, where you get the Parmenideans who are even more committed to the unchanging eternity of the true things than Platonists are, where the relation to time will be even more that the truth is all on the side of what doesn't change, end of things, so to speak. So Plato himself is not on in his own mind on an extrema of that continuum, right? He's got Parmenides way over here on this extrema, and he's got the Fluxus and Homer and Heraclitus over on this other extreme, and he thinks he has appropriately found the right position, you know, on the Parmenidean end of the continuum between them, but not all the way, right? But yes, this is extremely related to everything about how they're thinking about time and everything about how they're thinking about the relationship between knowledge and time and truth and time. is a truth that is false 5 minutes from now true? Right? What if the thing that you're finding to be true about is your heretical ability to do heretical predictions? How good is a theory of truth? Oh, sorry, is an element of truth whose standard is a heretical prediction if whether or not the prediction is heretical changes every 30 seconds? Right? Does that get to count as truth? If there was a 30-second window in which it would have been a heretical prediction, but then it turned out not to be. Right? So these are, you know, things at stake here. The rationalist end of this spectrum thinks that there needs to be something stable, reliable about truth, and the predictions that it makes for it to count as truth. And the people at the other end of the spectrum who are emphasizing the fluxus nature of things and are emphasizing the historical nature of things, including Heidegger, by the way, are normally doing it not for this posterior vulnerability to change with time kind of question, but from the where did you get it from, right? What's your access to it side of things, right? What revelation or experience or understanding or perception is this thing grounded on, founded on? And on the fluxus end of the spectrum, the need for it to be grounded in something like experience is always there. And the result of wanting to ground things in something like experience, no matter how generalized they're willing to let that experience be, is always going to leave them more open to seeing more change in things, because experience is changeable. Way more changeable than tissues of abstract reasoning. So that's why this whole thing is set up as a giant metaphysical debate between the fluxus and the status and the stasis people, right? In the sophist, the Parmenian strange will call it the war of the giants over being, right? The gigantomachia, the war of the giants over being, whether or not there is unchanging truth about unchanging being or all is change. And from Plato's own point of view, that metaphysical question is kind of outermost. And having taken a position in that outermost metaphysical discussion, right, he founds his theory of distinction between true and apparent world and the nature of truth within a particular understanding of that outermost metaphysical question. He's on the Parmenidean end of the spectrum, but not all the way to Parmenides, because Parmenides thinks that there is no truths about the apparent world. And Plato thinks there is. Parmenides almost thinks there's no truth about particulars as opposed to about being. And Plato thinks there is. But he's still definitely on that end of the spectrum. He's running away from the fluxus end of the spectrum. And this dialogue is showing you part of the reasons why. He thinks that end of the spectrum culminates in various forms of relativism that deny the reality of human knowledge. These are great questions, by the way. Okay. All right. So that is how the thesis that knowledge is perception gets dispensed with, it gets disposed of. And it means that the thing that we have just introduced and that Theatetus himself has just agreed to before he changes his opinion that knowledge is perception is this idea that there's this entire separate sphere of rational knowledge of the judgments of the common categories of experience upon things. And that is what prompts Theatetus to offer his next thesis, that knowledge is right opinion. And he introduces it as right opinion by saying, to say it's all opinion, Socrates, is out of one's power, since there's also false opinion. But there is a chance that true opinion is knowledge, and let that be my answer. For if it shows us as we go on that it's not, we'll try to say something else, just as we're doing right now. Notice he's willing to be a progressive fluxist about these the definitions he advances as the nature of truth. But he allows immediately that there's false opinion. I don't know that this is the first place where falseness is introduced in the dialogue, but it's certainly the first place where it's this explicit, right? He can't say that it's opinion, but it might be true opinion. So he hasn't yet qualified this with anything about an account, right? It's just, we're not talking about perception, we're talking about true opinion. Okay. And before even examining what he means by an opinion, Socrates is just fixated on the fact that he introduced the fact that we're talking about true opinion, not false opinion, by saying, how is false opinion even a thing? How is false opinion even possible? Why is this here? Why is Socrates raising difficulties about the supposed impossibility of the existence of false opinion? Have we actually dispensed with Protagoras completely yet? There's the first question to ask yourself. In the discussion with Protagoras, or about not even with Protagoras, in the discussion about perception, the criteria that was used to reject him was that knowledge is differentially distributed across human beings, right? So wouldn't it be the most natural thing in the world if right here, as soon as Theatetus brings up true and false opinions, he says, oh, right, and the ones with the false opinions are the ones who don't know and don't have the ability to radically predict the future, and the ones with the true opinions are those who do have the knowledge and do know how to predict the future. And so we've got a perfect saving of the fact that there is a distinction between the knowers and the not knowers, and all is good, right? Exactly the opposite of what he does. Instead, he's challenging he wants to know how something like a false opinion happens at all. Why?
Because it may not be false after all.
Well, where did we derive our rational categories that we're using to make our rational judgments that are supposedly judge of being and reach to truth? They were just whatever was common to our inner experience. We're trusting that. Is it trustworthy? Right?
No.
So this is the place where Socrates shows that he's not just a dogmatist saying that rationality rocks and perception is just for John Locke, right? No, he's challenging his own position. His own position says that when the soul judges for itself by itself about the things which it only has access to as what are common to all things, can it err? Does it err? Can we trust such judgments? And he wants to be in a position where, for the most part, unless specific things are happening, those judgments can be trusted. If you're going to found the possibility of knowledge in something like the purely rational had better be some pretty solid rock, or you're building on sand, right? So it better be pretty hard for pure logic to go wrong, right? So if we're just having our rational judgments of the things themselves directly judged by the soul itself, or off in the noetic realm, right? How does error enter into any of that? If we're supposedly having purely mathematical judgments of our common concepts that the machinery of our mind just generates for us correctly, and that we grasp, and we just reason about those clearly, how would we ever go wrong?
The same thing as Newtonian mechanics being right at one time, and it's not really wrong, but it's not as accurate as some others.
Well, there you're talking about the correspondence between an internal map and an external world. And yes, we'll get to that as one of the possible ways in which error can happen. But start with the purely rational. You're just trying to know things about number. You're just trying to know things about being and non-being, and the same and not the same, and like and unlike. And you have your thoughts and reasoning about that. Did those go wrong on you just because it's Tuesday? If you make a logical deduction and you write it down and you come back 2 days later, should you assume that it's changed? He wants that he needs there to be for the rationalist argument to have any strength to it. It needs to be the case that most of the time, unless you're making specific mistakes, unless you're doing specific things wrong, you can trust reasoning. So this is what you're getting here is Socrates's version of what in Descartes would be your acid of rational doubt, right? He's going to say, right, how do we make errors at all, right? He's going to find ways we make errors. Don't worry about the outcome, right? But he needs to find out how purely rational thought results in rational error, because if he doesn't, the Fluxus is going to say, why would anything going on that's only a movement in the brain of a bewildered ape ever go right? Why would you expect it to? The point is, this is less unmotivated than it might initially appear. It might look like this is just coming flying out of left field. Why did you bring up the impossibility of false judgment? And the answer is, if there isn't something difficult about false judgment in the first place, there's no reason to trust rational reasoning at all. It better be hard to be wrong when you're doing geometry, right? Okay.
Say that again, what you said before geometry.
It better be hard to be wrong when you're doing geometry.
You said something before that.
Sorry.
Something, yeah, you can't be right unless you're wrong, or you could be wrong, something like that.
Okay.
Never mind.
Okay, and this is where he says we have to finish a little bit small, well, instead of a lot badly. Okay. So the first arguments against it are very slippery and very sophistic. Why does this matter? Because we've just introduced the whole sphere of something like noetic reasoning as being the supposed paradigm of human knowledge. And if we find that everything we encounter there is slippery dialectical reasoning that results in an aporia, we've just gone out of the frying pan and into the fire, right? So the very first thing we get is a tissue of monstrous, apparently rational, apparently solid rational reasoning that shows that false judgment is impossible, which itself is a false judgment. We know that empirically from the first half of the argument, right? And you can track it through, and you'll find, that the argument, plays upon equivocations of what it means to have knowledge, and some of those things are all things that are brought out later. He will have them take back things that Theatetus too rapidly agreed to along the way. It is useful to track what those are. The basic story is that having knowledge, being right, having the experience of the thing you're knowing about, having the appropriate referent to the thing that you're trying to think about, these are all getting conflated linguistically. The language is too imprecise. And the result is that you can easily arrive at false conclusions that seem to follow verbally from the previous statements, right? So if there's a lesson here, it's that imprecise noetic reasoning is not a sound guide to truth, right? If it's going to be anything like a sound guide to truth, it's going to have to get a heck of a lot more precise than it is now. Okay. There's one particular move that is used here that is characteristic. And some of these things, by the way, were sort of traditional paradoxes in Greek philosophy, even before Plato. They occur in some of his other dialogues too. There's the famous one in the Meno of you can't learn anything because if you already know about it, you don't need to learn about it. And if you don't know anything about it, you can't even figure out whether or not the thing you're trying to learn is about it. Right. So you equivocate sufficiently on the about part. You have to be familiar enough to study the subject, but that means you have to have some prior general categorization to fit the thing into, or you can't even tell that you're studying biology as opposed to astronomy, or looking in the right direction using the right kind of instrument. Right. You have to know what you're looking for that much to look at all. But there's no reason to go look if you already know it. So you have to both know it and not know it. You have to know it in some loose enough sense to have a map to be looking in the right place, and you have to not know it enough to have a ton to learn about the subject, right? And both of those are very easily linguistically conflated with one another as you know it or you don't know it. It's equivocation on know, right? And there's lots of places in the second half of this dialogue where there's equivocation on terms like that. The other one that comes up later turns on this issue of designation. What do I mean by that? You know something, you think you know something about X, right? And there's two separate pieces of that. There's the thing you think you know about it, and there's the X that it's supposedly about. Well, the thing you think you know is true of something, but it's Y, not X. Okay, so is that false knowledge, or is it true knowledge of Y? Right. So if the set of things that you think you know fit together, then they're still knowledge, but they're just knowledge pointing at a different thing, right? Which may not exist in the world, by the way. It may not be instantiated, whatever. But there's the tissue of knowledge has something that it is true about, but it might not designate the thing you thought you were judging. So the point of this is that you can have things. It's not easy to tell apart an error of the attribution and an error of the designation. By designation, I mean which named thing are you trying to point at, right? Because any particular set of concepts are going to be true of some set of things and true in some abstract, mathematical sense, right? You'll be describing some object, right? But that object might not be the thing you thought you were aiming at. So, but fine, you're talking about the other thing then. You're talking about the thing for which those theorems were true. So you had perfect knowledge of something which you slightly misnamed. Change your name. You're right now. It's right. So problems like that are being brought up here. And this slipperiness comes in automatically from the fact that we're now dealing with pure opinion, meaning this purely dialectical, verbal kind of understanding. Right? We've lost our anchor to experience. Right? We're no longer relating this to experience. We're just reasoning with concepts. How reliable are the concepts? What kinds of slipperiness do concepts have? We saw all kinds of ways which perceptions had slipperiness in the first half of the dialogue. Well, guess what? Concepts have slipperiness too. And the whole second half of the dialogue is only about some of them. Okay. So the wax tablet. There's three different models that we're going to get to. There's the wax tablet, the Avery, and the alphabet. And each of them is brought up as a model to address a different kind of way in which falsehood can arise, false understanding can arise. The wax tablet is brought up to explain mistakes of perception that you could call like this misdesignation problem. So the paradigm they have is a very simple one, right? Someone's off in the distance and you misrecognize them. You know Theatetus and you see Socrates approaching and you think that the Socrates approaching is Theatetus, right? So that's a kind of empirical error that occurs. The question is, how does that occur in the machine in the put it this way, the noetic machinery, right? So okay, and the wax model of the mind, of memory, is brought in to try to address this. Why do you need a model of memory? You need some way of relating the past knowledge of the thing, which is not the current perception of the thing, to the current perception of the thing. So the need to tie up both a past and a present on the one hand, and a conceptual form of something and a perception about it, on the other hand, to tie up those things, you need some other, you need some intervening step. Now, in some sense, the intervening step is fallacious because you have the same problem of recognizing the commonality of the pattern on the wax tablet as in the imprinting on the wax tablet, right? And it's never explained exactly how the experience imprints itself on the wax tablet. It's only introduced as a source of almost physical error, if I can put it this way. You have a misimprint, you print things over each other. The actual kind of empirical motivation for this model is the perceptions of the differences in intellect. Moving back to the beginning where Theatetus was being praised for his character and how he learned everything quickly, and he wasn't one of those flighty people who learns quickly but then forgets everything, and he wasn't one of those dull plodding people who can never learn anything fast but has enough ballast that he keeps it once he's got it. And he was the perfect kind who is quick to learn and but retains easily, right? All of those characteristics of good memory, good learner, high intellect are now being given a kind of physical model of, he's got a better piece of wax, right? But this is all a pretty thin and sort of physical intuition motivation for it. You're basically appealing to characteristics of experienced objects and natural copying to explain what seems to be going on with the phenomena of recognition and matching that the mind does. Okay, so there's lots of people who've criticized the argument on this basis. It's got other bigger problems, which we'll get to, but that's the reason for introducing it. It's trying to explain, it's meant to be a model of how slips between experience and memory happen. Okay. What's the reason it's going to be rejected? Anyone follow that? The reason for the rejection of the wax model? The wax model only predicts that you will make mistakes when you're trying to relate a past perception to a present reality. If you're trying to deal with something which was never a perception, it cannot explain what is happening. So if you make a math error, the wax model won't help you, right? And there are pure math errors. You make math calculations where you're trying to talk about 12 and you think you're thinking about 11 in exactly the same way that you misidentify the approaching friend. You misidentify two numbers with each other. And Theatetus says, yes, and it's even more common when the numbers are bigger, right? So the point is, the same sort of error seems to occur even when you're dealing with purely noetic entities. So it's not rejected because it's inadequate to the phenomena of variation of memory, and it's also not rejected because it leaves out future time as opposed to past time. It's rejected because it's not just too tied to memory, it's too tied to perception. It doesn't explain how you can have errors that did not originate from a perception. And there are errors which clearly originate from noetic experience itself. There are errors in pure math. And it's important to notice this because it is often put forward as a criticism against the Platonists is that the reason that they are running to the purely noetic realm is because they think it will be a realm completely free of error. But in the text of it, nothing like it, right? The wax model is a bunk model of how the mind works precisely because it predicts that the only errors you would have would be errors stemming from faulty perception or faulty memory of a perception, faulty recording of a past perception. But Socrates himself says, no, there are errors in pure math. Therefore, there's nothing like just a mechanical copying problem going on in error. Okay.
So is there a way to take the wax tablet to a modern representation of memory like we have in a computer and further debunk it from that standpoint about how it doesn't really match because what goes into the memory is the perception to begin with?
To some degree, there's a matter of needing to take the perception and turn it into something like information to even put it into memory, and that's the lossy encoding of the wax imprint, right? But the more basic modern version of the problem is the correct block of ones and zeros being in memory is not an understanding. to get the understanding out, the CPU has to process that block, those ones and zeros in that block of the understanding with, you know, the appropriate subtlety and intelligence to, you know, to use it correctly and so forth. And all the decoding of what was there is doing all the work, right? So the reading and the writing aspect is only telling you something about something like information has some minimal footprint that needs to be instantiated, something like that. But it's not telling you the way in which an imprinted form is encoded or decoded, right?
Sort of like you can never read a CD without knowing the red book on it.
Or if you don't have, you might not have to know it, but some piece of equipment at your disposal must.
Yeah, CD player has to have embedded in it the red book coding of how CDs are made.
Something like it, at least a sufficient decoder for its operational use. And clearly we have that for minds, right? We don't know how our minds work. We know that our minds work and we're able to use them, right? But we have the same kind of operational handy relationship to the what our minds are able to do that we have to technology. But I don't think there's anything fundamentally wrong with the idea that there is an information encoded in a form and a read and write operation involved in memory. Those things are fine, but it's not an adequate explanation of human error, because errors are not simply miscopyings, right? Not every error is a memory fault. Not every bug is a memory fault, right? Something like that. And the processing side, not just the memory address side, can be a source of it. You could make other arguments against it from the missing future aspect of it. If knowledge is supposed to be radical prediction, something which only relates remembered past to a present pattern would be a problem. The other attack that is often made upon it is that the way in which you go from the external experience through anything you do in the encoding to whatever you're writing is where all the actual work is happening. And you haven't explained any of that by just saying that there's a place that the results, once you've got them, written down. But all the ways in which there has to be something like information and structure, we'll actually get to in the alphabet example, in the language example later, that paradigm. Here we're just the first notion of error is something like insufficiently distinct impression, and as a model for something that can happen, fine, but it's not a theory of error. It's not a general enough theory of error to explain the errors that exist, because errors exist without experience. Okay, but
yeah, kind of where I was taking this is trying to take each of these next steps he's going through and applying it to the AI situation and seeing the faults in AI that are still there in what Plato stated.
Sure. I mean, I also just like to use those modernizations to think about the ways in which he was clearly already thinking about something like information.
Yeah.
Right. So not just words. By the way, he does elicit an important agreement from Theatetus along the way, that when they're talking about this sort of reasoning, he asks him, is it for you like what it is for me, a kind of internal dialogue one has with oneself without speech, but still using words? And Theatetus perhaps too readily agrees. So they agree on something like the verbal stream model of ratiocination, something like that. And that's something which will have a profound afterlife in Aristotle, who will make the proposition the place where all of these things occur. And it's also important for Heidegger's diagnosis of what is and isn't right here, so to speak. But it's almost an aside to Socrates. He makes relatively little use of the claim that something like an internal dialogue in words or monologue in words is involved in something like reasoning. Along the way, we've got multiple allusions to logos as this gathering together, and logos as an internal speech. Those are not obviously the same thing, and the broader sense is more fundamental to the most of the Platonism you're getting here, Aristotle will make tons out of the reducing that gathering together to what the proposition does. He will verbalize the crap out of all this and turn it into a whole theory of verbal logic, which, by the way, is the primary subject of Heidegger's actual attack, which we'll get to in the next couple of sessions. My point being that Aristotle is way open to most of his attacks than Plato is. The point of contact here is Socrates does agree with Theaetetus here that there's something about this layer of abstract reasoning which can be thought of as an internal dialogue and judgment in words. And I think Theaetetus agrees to that too easily. I think it's clearly more complicated than that in phenomenal reality. Okay, but let's go on to the next model. The next model is the Avery model. Why do we have an Avery model? The Avery model is you've got all the things that you know, and you stuff them away in different locations in your brain, and you reach in for the bird called 12 and you grab the bird called 11 instead, because they're flying around and they're moving, and you miss and you don't manage to grab bird 12 and you grab bird 11. And this can happen to you even if you learned about bird 12 and bird 11 without any particular relevance to previous experience. So it avoids the problem of the previous one only being tied to experience. It gives us a way of explaining an error by a misidentification that can happen in memory recall rather than memory recording, right? So in the recall rather than the recording, I can grab the wrong bird. That's the claim. Okay, but this fundamentally thinks that any sort of rational knowledge sort of remains and is true, and the errors that occur, pardon me, are all misattributions that are retrieval of the wrong piece of previous knowledge. Okay. So in a way, this is going back to the previous misidentification idea, the idea that each of the truths that you know points at something, but is it pointing at the right thing? Or sorry, are you using the one that points at the thing that you think you're thinking about? Right, there's the naming problem. This one doesn't last very long. The things which it is appealed to for, there is a wide typology of the levels of experience of these things. So Socrates distinguishes between the having knowledge of it, possessing it. You can possess the knowledge if you learned it once, but you only have it if it's the top of your memory, so to speak. Right. So whereas the previous thing was kind of a model of memory, this one now becomes a model of the learning and forgetting and the having and the impresenting of your having beenness that we got in basic problems of phenomenology is being dealt with here on for the mental level, right? And you have learned enough geometry or enough arithmetic to be able to do all the arithmetic problems. You have an appropriate algorithm for it. That doesn't mean that right now you know what 324 times 682 is, right? You could work it out, but you'd have to work it out, right? So why? What kind of knowledge is that, right? It's a something that you learned, a something that you had, but you don't have right now, at least until you do some further logical work. So that's the kind of slipperiness about conceptual knowledge that this Avery model is meant to address. But it's still pretty slim on explaining why you would grab the wrong bird. Why does this bird look like that bird? Why in the same part of the cage? Why don't you have a wider cage? And within a few exchanges, Theaetetus is reduced to arguing that maybe you have some birds flying around your head that are bits of knowledge, and some birds flying in your head that are bits of falsehood, right? And this comes up because you have to, you can have errors which have to do with absences, and you can have errors which have to do with things you haven't learned. You can have other kinds of misidentifications besides past with past. And as soon as that happens, the Avery model breaks down. And although Socrates salutes the attempt to save it by introducing falsehoods flying around inside your head that you could catch instead, that won't work at all. There's an infinite number of falsehoods. See you, Brian. Thanks for coming by. If you have any other questions, you can feel free to leave them in the meetup site, etc., and we can try to address them next time, or just come back. Okay. So the Avery model is even weaker than the Wax model. I think it's fair to say. So okay, we haven't really explained for any of those things how if I put it this way, purely rational error is possible, but we have managed to elicit the fact that that slipperiness happens with language in the same way that slipperiness happens with perception. And where Socrates goes immediately after that is to the, as he puts it, the entire profession that exists because there is a difference between right opinion and knowledge. And that profession is the law. The people who argue in law courts are trying to be convincing, not true, and they know that having an opinion about something and having knowledge about that thing are two different things. And Socrates says, is there any chance that in the time that that single glass of running water, a whole giant jury of people could learn the truth about what happened in some past crime? Right? No. But they can be brought to an opinion about it. Yes. Right? So this is where the motivation for with an account comes in, for justified true belief. The true belief that you can be convinced of falsehoods in a courtroom. You can also be convinced of truths in a courtroom. But if you're convinced by the same arguments that would convince you of the falsehood in the courtroom to the truth in the courtroom, then what you have is not knowledge. Okay, so we already had the law back when we were at Theodorus on this stage. After the models of memory, the law comes in to shoot down the entire idea that knowledge could be right opinion without something else. Something else has to be added. And this is also critical for the previous things because we didn't really know what was being stored about any of these past experiences, right? And now we're getting towards what is actually stored about them. What is actually stored about them is something like the account. There's the opinion and there's the account. And the account is going to do a lot of the work for it counting as knowledge. The word for the account is a derivative of logos, right? It's a speech about them. It's a speech, a reason, a logos, an account. These are all the same thing in Greek. And this is, it has to come with a logos, with a reason. Okay. And before we get into, all kinds of reasonable things you could say about having reasons for knowing things or move towards some version of that as justified, Socrates brings up this other thing about accounts. That people say that of certain things there are no accounts and of other things there are accounts. This is where the language example comes in. Why does it come in? The doctrine he's bringing up is the idea that the only thing that you can have an account of, that you can have a logism of, is a structure, an articulation. A structure or an articulation or a gathering together is a pattern, and it's made out of something, right? But it's not the things that it's made out of. The articulation is distinct from the things being articulated. What's being articulated? The elements. There's some underlying elements that enter into an articulation, and the distinction between an arrangement or articulation and the things being articulated is the distinction between account, arrangement, logos, and elements. Elements are letters in Greek, right? So the idea here is that there's some set of atomic facts, atomic counters that the account is made of, and the account is explaining the arrangement of them. So there is, and the philosophical claim that Socrates sort of puts in the mouth of Theatetus, he says, is this the one you're thinking of? Is that there is no account that can be given of the elements themselves. Accounts only enter when you're talking about arrangements of the elements themselves. Okay, this will later be rejected, but that's the claim that's being brought in. What's the underlying thought here? The underlying thought here is something like there's no explanation of the atoms, the fundamental particles, the wood the wagon is made of, right? The arrangement is what you can explain. And when you're explaining the arrangement, you're explaining how those counters, so to speak, those unanalyzable atom-like, leaves of the conceptual tree are arranged with one another, but there's no account of the atoms themselves, of the leaves themselves. That's the claim. The modern analog of that would be our n ones and zeros, which are just distinction, nothing else, right? There's no accounting of them. Or we would say that it is indifferent what you make a pattern out of. The pattern's the same wherever you make it from. There's also elements of this in atomic theory. Okay, the language theory though is where it's immediately examined, and the idea there is that the syllables in the words have an arrangement, but the letters just are. They're just placeholders and counters for the arrangements, and they don't signify on their own, right? All right, that's the claim. So, and he examines this quite a bit with Theatetus, and he uses it to introduce all these philosophical chestnuts of the difference between the whole and the all. There's the set of the parts, and the difference between the set and the articulation, and etc. Understand, there's no set theory, and there's no theory of logic at the time when this is written, right? This is exploring all this de novo, right? But many of the concepts that we try to be clear about these days with notions like set are what's being discussed. And it's not clear that we're entirely clear about them even with our notions like set, right? A perfect example of this is when he's talking about there's an equivocation on part where he says, is there anything left in the whole besides all of the parts? Right. So this is saying that you can take the articulated structure and you can equate it with the set in the literal set theory sense of its elements. Well, there is something that's being left out of that, which is how they're actually arranged. Right. The set is the elements without the arrangement. Right. The structure adds an arrangement. Okay. Does that mean the arrangement is one of the parts? Do you put the arrangement in the set alongside the elements? We don't. We distinguish between the structure as something which is more than a set that has structure, the set, which is just the atomized version of that structure, which has pounded all the structure out of it and only just given us a count of the elements, right? But the fact that there is the union of the flatten of something is, in put it in Mathematica terms, is what you mean by the set of it, and means you pounded all the structure out of it. But does that mean that if you want to explain what the whole contains besides its elements, that you have to include the structure? Does that mean the structure is one of the parts? Verbally, it has to be one of the parts because it's the thing you left out. But verbally, if it's a thing that you should include because otherwise you're leaving it out, then it's one of the parts. It should have just been included as an element alongside the rest of the set. So those are the kinds of problems that he's tangling Theatetus up in here. Why? I mean, I think primarily to show that the purely abstract reasoning layer has its own complexity. It has its own philosophical complexity. There's also a debate going on with the atomists, if I can put it that way, that he introduces here, as to the intelligibility of the atoms themselves. Because Plato has a definite stake in this. He's not bringing it out here, but he believes in the intelligibility of the elements, right? And he'll appeal to when you're learning to spell, you have to learn to recognize the letters separately on their own. His version of those letters are the Platonic forms, the ideas, especially the most common ideas, the greatest kinds, the stuff you'll get in the sophist, and the idea that those are the counters of thought. The underlying primitive counters that are used for all rational thought are these ideas, but that they can be rationally understood as well as composed. That's sort of, Platonism tout core, so to speak, is what that has to elaborate. And you get some of that in the Sophists, but it's not fully articulated. Okay, what's the point of this? We're steering towards something like trying to make a rationalism in which you would have to have atomic underlying, fundamental concepts. You would have to understand each of them would have to be conceptually intelligible in itself, not just at least as to having an essence, not just having an articulation of them. It can't be a blind counter, so to speak, where you don't get rationality out of it. And then thinking of arranging of those concepts as that out of which other, look at it this way, conceptual things are made, right? Other conceptual things are thought of as structures of underlying atomic concepts, where those underlying atomic concepts are things like being and not being, same and not the same, motion and rest, being good, beautiful, etc. All the typical Platonic forms. Okay, and he doesn't bring up all those other forms here, but that's clearly the underlying motivation here, is to distinguish between an atom, which is thought of on some sort of physical model and is therefore unknowable in itself, and you can only tell things about its relations to other things, which is where the fluxus would come out. That's why you get the notion of the unintelligible atom, as opposed to the underlying things themselves being purely concept-like and therefore having essences and being intelligible all the way down. That's kind of the contrast in the last two sections. Okay. But having rung through a bunch of those things, and he's obviously way over Theaetetus's head on some of this stuff. So Theaetetus drops the ball multiple times on some of the things he concedes about the relationships between the whole and the all, and Socrates tangles him in things he shouldn't ever concede, fallacy of composition problems, all kinds of things. And there's all kinds of landmines laid around there that Theaetetus falls whole into. And to me, one of the points of that is clearly to show that, at least dialectically, if not in the perfect hands, you can make error in this domain as easily as you can make errors about 11 and 12, right? But still, the articulation of language is our standing model of information, if I could put it that way. It's our model of how you get arbitrarily complex things out of a small number of intelligible primitives. The letters can be composed into syllables, into the words, into anything that you can write, and to any conceptual structure. And the way in which that articulation can happen from a few primitive underlyings that don't have any of that structure in them themselves, and all the real information is in the structuring, right? The model for that is language. You get that repeated, by the way, in people like the Epicureans, who make the same appeal even to their physical theory is based upon the idea of spelling out their atoms like letters. Okay, and I think that the Empedocles had a similar notion of the correspondence between the elements and the letters, that it's playing on this word, having the same word in Greek. Okay. But does he accept that all of this is trying to lay out what we mean by adding the account? And what counts as the account is getting more and more complicated, right? It starts off with something like a simple reason why I believe this, and it turns into a fully articulated, down to the atoms, exhaustive description, right? It's not enough that you know that a wagon is made of 5 things. You have to be able to have a blueprint exact enough that you can make a working wagon. And if you can have that, you have to have it all the way down to the elements, right? So to count as veridical knowledge, useful for prediction, etc., it's going to have to be an exhaustive account, and that exhaustive account winds up being the same as saying you have to already have knowledge of the thing. So smuggled into that is that knowledge of the thing might be something like its pure articulated intellectual structure. Maybe that's a theory of knowledge here, but verbally on the outside, we're just saying that true opinion with an account, which is true opinion with knowledge, is what knowledge is. So we end on that self-referential aporia of we're saying that you have to fully know the thing in order for your true opinion about it to count as knowledge. Okay, self-reference. Okay, maybe we fleshed out what it means to fully know a thing with the example of knowing the wagon well enough to build a working one. And by knowing it, we mean having its intellectual structure down to these intelligible conceptual atoms, something like that. Okay, I've gotten through. I want to give people a chance to react to those last pieces before we react to the whole thing. I know, Craig, you brought up the language stuff, and you're interested in the language stuff. Are there things in these last sections that you wanted to jump in on?
No, I just like the way he went through the analysis of parts and wholes, and then in parts and subparts, and the fact that there's no easy single level that you can deal with within what they had there. I also found it fascinating as he got into that, and he started getting into language and syllables and when words and all that kind of stuff. Images and pictures disappeared, and so. You know, there's always a question of how can you describe an image, or how do you describe what you see with words? He didn't touch that at all. So that was another thing I found kind of interesting.
Correct. The closest he got was when he was talking about the wagon, and he mentions, you know, the wagon, breaking it down into, it has to have these 6 things, but that doesn't actually account as an account of the wagon because it's not enough to make it. And the whole wagon has 100 pieces of wood, right? And that's even introduced. The adage from Hesiod is that a wagon is 100 pieces of wood, and if you don't know the whole 100, you don't know the wagon. Obviously, the wagon is not just the 100 pieces of wood; it's the articulation and that assembles correctly the 100 pieces of wood with all their sizes and orientations and shapes known, right? Something like that. It's that articulate structure. That's the closest you get to there being a lingering reference to something like the picture as something like the plan, as something like the form in an imagistic sense, in that part. Mostly, once he gets to language example, he goes full linguistic on you. And there are some games being played there, though. I think the translator even points this out because Theatetus looks like Socrates, and they mention their similarities with bulging eyes and smashed in nose, right? And when they're talking about the designation things, oh, we have to, that reminded me, you reminded me that I left something out, the Google Whack. We have to get back to the Google Whack. The conceptual cuts, right? The conceptual cuts you make, that it has to be someone with bulging eyes. There's too many people there with bulging eyes and a smashed in nose. There's too many people there with exactly these kinds of bulging eyes and smashed in nose. Okay, now you're down to just Socrates and Theaetetus, right? Because they're the only ones that fit exactly that shape, but they share that shape. So you're not down to one thing when you have that conceptual articulation. But the other person who is present is young Socrates, who doesn't share the face shape of Socrates, but shares his name. So if you only have to spell their names, then those two are going to be exactly equivalent. So the idea that you can be equivalent in the purely verbal sense, and you can be equivalent in the purely visual sense, are being contrasted there in the two young interlocutors. But the other thing I left out was there's a place toward the end where he's trying to talk about what counts as an adequate account. And he puts forward the idea that one of the adequate accounts could be if you have a designation from concepts sufficient that it designates only one thing. So you have a unique description in the sense that this set of concepts, if you took one of them out, it might be general and designate multiple things. But if you include this last one, it becomes a sufficient description that tells you, it identifies a single particular in the world. Why doesn't this work? The first point is that you don't know the particulars in the world, right? And designating only one of them, you're still designating also all of the intellectual things you're designating. You're not trying to use words to capture particulars, as if the particulars are prior to the concepts. There's none of that going on here. There's a designation problem as well, right? You want to say that these concepts are a sufficient account if they just point to this particular, but a name can point to that particular. What makes the description different from the name is not that it points to the particular, but it does more than point to it, right? It distinguishes it from everything else. So this is related to some of the issues about names and designators and possible worlds that you get in people like Kripke later. But there's a lot of fun, if I can put it this way, fun formal philosophical problems here in designation stuff. But as what's going to count as an adequate description, the idea that it only picks out one thing in the world is hopeless. It won't work. In terms of modern equivalence, there was a game people had in the early aughts, I think it was, and the game was to come up with a set of Google search terms that would have exactly one hit. Right? If you set them any broader, right, you're going to get way too many hits, and if you set them any narrower, you won't get any hits. And it's to get a set of search terms that gets you exactly one page back was called a Google Whack, right? Because a single mole, right, is all that lies under that. This notion of a set of conceptual distinctions that gets you exactly one particular, right, is the theoretical equivalent of that sort of combination search. It's just that instead of retrieving a single web page, it's supposed to retrieve a single particular from the universe, right? The problem is the universe is underspecified here, right? Material universe, conceptual universe, right? Yeah, if you let the universe of things that can be designated in this way be large enough, you never know if you have a sufficient description in this sense. Okay, so that was the last of the sort of fun issues, philosophical issues along the way I want to mention. Obviously, next time we're going to be getting on to the Heidegger stuff. But before we do that, anyone have reactions to the where we got in this whole thing? Because we went through I think a pretty convincing argument against the knowledge is simply perception, and some arguments for that. A bunch of conceptual distinctions between the philosophical and the sophistical take on these things, and what some of the underlying motivations might be. Then to the true opinion stuff. And we saw in the true opinion stuff something like the founding of the distinction between the real and the apparent worlds smuggled in there. And then with the justified true belief attempt, we learned that all the job is on the justification, which has to do with something like a dream of exhaustive conceptual structure. And there's something about that which is as big a problem as the original was, rather than a solution to the problem of what has to be added to true belief to make it knowledge. It's something like a whole theory of knowledge itself, into what that articulation is. And it's not really fully laid out here. There's sketches of it, there's things which are laid out in Sophist about it, and there's things which Aristotle goes in a different direction about it. Heidegger will also, in his second half, talk about what he thinks is left behind there, because he thinks there's a road not taken there in the second half of this. But next time it's going to be Heidegger dealing with the is knowledge perception aspect. And that's going to be a critical thing for Heidegger, because we know that Heidegger, he has this phenomenal bent in the first place, and he wants to get at this notion of truth as unconcealment. And truth as unconcealment as some sort of direct contact with what is closer to being perception, even if it is meant to also include noetic perception, than it is to something like conceptual knowledge, as you get in the second half. So although the most critical part of what Heidegger is doing in the standpoint of criticizing Plato and Aristotle is probably the second section that we're going to do in our time after this one coming up. The one next is probably the place where he's dealing with the theses about what truth is that are closest to his own motivation and positions. And it's useful to track to what degree Heidegger is a Pythagorean and to what degree he's not. Does he buy these Platonic arguments against Pythagoras, or does he not buy them, and why? Anyway, that's all going to be for sections 1 to 3 of part 2 of the Essence of Truth next time. Comments on the whole session? Was it useful? A few nods. Gabriel, what do you think? Is this what you were expecting, or is this what you saw in it, or?
Yeah, kind of. I liked a lot what you said about how that second half where they're going into right opinion and right opinion with an account. All those kind of sophistical arguments are almost like an illustration of how language can be as slippery as perception. And I liked that because, like I mentioned, I'd recently read Bloom on the Republic, where he really emphasizes like what is written between the lines, so to speak. Yeah. What is Plato trying to show us here? And so I like that interpretation, because otherwise, just reading him, you're sort of like a bit frustrated with what he's doing, like he's being sophistical. So yeah, I like that a lot. Yes. I also liked a lot all the talk about parts and wholes and stuff like that. And just as a prompt to make you think about these things, I don't the idea that the forms of the elements, I don't fully, I guess, understand that. So for instance, thinking about the wagon, you could also say that the wagon itself, the form of the wagon, the structure, the form, that's the form. And I know it's debated whether Plato thought that there were forms of like assembled, like created things, but that seems to be, to me, to be the more logical way to sort of say this like the whole isn't reducible to the parts because the whole is itself a form.
Mhm.
How you construct a wagon out of Platonic forms, I'm not so clear on.
So I can give you a take on that. So I partly agree with you that in the case of the thing like the wagon, the sort of more commonsensical way of understanding it is it's just sort of trying to tell you that the blueprint is the information that is the essence of the thing or something like that. And
Mhm.
and thinking of form or arrangement that way as literally just a shape in a matter is exactly the direction Aristotle goes, right? He
Mhm.
wants to understand Platonic idea as form, as just shape and shaped matter. And he thinks that that's the element of Platonic idealism that is salvageable, so to speak, right?
Mhm.
But it's definitely and deliberately an abandonment of the full rationalist vision, if I can put it this way. If you want to get an idea of what the full rationalist vision would, might look like, think of Principia Mathematica. Think of the attempt to construct the natural numbers from set theories, starting with nothing more than the empty set, and then after you've constructed the rational numbers, to have a whole bunch of elaborate machinery for talking about all the theorems about rational numbers and all the theorems of arithmetic, etc. Now imagine that you, as part of your decoding apparatus for your architectural diagram of the wagon, you have an explanation of what you meant by saying is it should have 4 wheels that uses a reference all the way back to the Principia Mathematica chapter on 4 that explains that 4 is this set of concepts down to the concept empty set arranged in this way, right?
Mhm.
So you've got a blueprint down to just what I mean by set, empty set, primitive operations at the atomic mathematical level, and I've got an entire encoding language from that layer all the way up to the wagon diagram,
Mm.
right? That's what he's talking about as the idea that the full account would be all the way taken all the way down to the atomic rational forms, so that the primitive counters of that system would be these lowest level, most common to all things, Platonic ideas, and but the way that you arranged and spelled them, could, yes, assemble up to the wagon, but you wouldn't be specifying the wagon by pointing to a physical wagon that was supposed to correspond to this diagram, right? You'd be explaining the elements of the wagon from their, put it this way, their set theoretical construction form.
And
Right.
that would apply to not just the notion of there's 4 wheels, but the notion of
Correct.
wheel itself, right?
Correct. The wheel itself would make reference to the definition of circle and make reference to the definition of diameter, and make reference to the definition of the diameter being in this geometric ratio to this other aspect of the wagon, and everything would be math, right? Everything would be set theory and math, and you would have just encoding algorithm after encoding algorithms for turning those set theory definitions in math into something a machine could understand to build a wagon, right? That's what would count for Plato as the purely rational wagon. Does that help?
It does, yeah. Thank you.
Cool. Okay, so we should talk a little about when we want to do next time. We know what we're going to do.
Another quick question on that.
Yes.
So the other analogy in the science world is you really don't do chemistry using quarks.
Absolutely.
You use elements.
Correct.
And even getting from the physics to the elements is still problematic. So we built
not only that, it may even be formally undecidable, but yes, keep going. I know where you're going.
That was the next point I was getting to, was Principia kind of ran into problems with Gödel.
Absolutely.
And so even it seems like Plato didn't foresee Gödel, but there's a definite hitch in the woodwork there, or the wagon works, or whatever you want to call it, that says that may not even be possible to do.
Sure, and the idea that you can, if you spelled everything out with its atomic elements, that you could construct everything up to anything that could possibly exist, right? As a practical means of understanding something is obviously just a formalist stream, right? And in Plato, it's just that formalist stream, as well as an investigation of those atomic ideas themselves. But here's the issue, right? From Plato's point of view, the question is not whether or not you could do that. The question is not whether or not nature already has, right? He thinks that that's the way the world is actually constructed and actually works. He doesn't think it's a map. He thinks it's the territory. And yes, for your conceptual understanding, you will have to pick the level of analysis that you can operate on in order to have a tractable problem, and you will never try to do chemistry with quarks, right? Not only that, the descriptions can be true even if the underlying things are completely abstracted from, because they may not depend upon the underlyings at all, right? You can build universal computer out of Tinker Toys. So if the arrangement is the thing, then you only need the arrangement at the level of abstraction that matters for the thing you care about. And I think that it's fair to say that modern science, especially modern complexity theory, has gotten way more sophisticated about those sort of information questions than Plato ever was. But Plato was the guy who had the dream that the formalistic machinery behind the world could be the way the world actually works. He got that dream in part from people like Pythagoras before him, but he's the guy who spelled it out. And this is kind of the book where it's the original manifesto for that dream, if I can put it that way. This one, and especially the sophist after it. So I entirely agree with you that in our modern understanding of these things, we recognize that something like formal truth is going to be relative to a level of analysis, and there isn't one consistent. We're not going to be able to construct one consistent seamless structure from the empty set up to the universe, right? But the fact that we cannot construct it, and it may even be formally undecidable whether or not you can construct it, doesn't mean that that something like that couldn't be the way the world actually is and works, right? It could be an infinite amount of math of that kind. You get me? Anyway, that's the fair point. By the way, if you're at all interested in some of the wackier out there ideas of people looking into this right now, look up a paper by Stephen Wolfram about the Ruliad, which is an idea of a single mathematical object that might be the universe. But it's a modern take on that idea from someone who knows that complexity theory. Okay, another guy who thinks that there's a more conventional version of that would be Max Tegmark's Our Mathematical Universe. But Stevens is definitely more information and computationally driven. All right. So I was trying to pick out next time. Do people need 3 weeks or 4 weeks? I could do the 16th of October. The alternatives are 16th or 23rd of October. Should be 3rd and 4th, but not last Sundays. It's about 70 pages, I think, that we're reading. It's ends on page 195. Begins on page 122. So yes, 73 pages, 74 pages of Heidegger, though. Is 3 weeks enough? If I don't get an objection in 3 weeks, I'm going to say October 16th. Okay, getting a thumbs up and an okay sign. Gabriel, are you going to be able to join us by any chance? What do you think?
Unfortunately not, no.
Okay. Well, have you seen this book? Do you know this book at all?
What's the book? The Essence of Truth.
Yes,
no, I haven't really, I don't know anything about it.
So the first part of it is Heidegger interpreting Plato's allegory of the cave. And the second part of it is Heidegger interpreting the dialogue of Theatetus.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, we started reading this, and because he's about to go to the Theatetus, we interrupted to go read the Theatetus. And now that we've done the Theatetus, we're going back to Heidegger on the Theatetus. That's what we're going to do next. So
cool.
Anyway, that'll be next 2 sessions. So parts 1 to 3 of, sorry, sections 1 to 3 of part 2 of Heidegger and the Essence of Truth for the 16th. And I'll see you guys then. All right, I'm gonna stop recording. Thanks.